Good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen. Welcome to Tallinn. Welcome to our conference, Contemporary Approaches to Learning and Teaching. My name is Artur Taevere. Tallinn is my hometown, so I'm from here, but right now I live in the UK. I work for the British Council as the Senior Schools Advisor. The reason I am with you here today as a moderator actually is that the person who was meant to do this, unfortunately, he injured his back recently, so I got a phone call 2 days ago asking whether I could step in. So anyway, here I am. I will do my best. I think this conference, apart from the last-minute change of moderator, I think has been very well prepared. So I think we're going to have a good time, today and tomorrow. The context for this conference, I think, is that there is a lot of change happening in the world right now. Sometimes you wake up in the morning and you read the news and you are filled with despair. It seems that the world is changing very quickly, and sometimes it feels that the world is also getting crazier. Sometimes it makes you think you don't really know how to cope with it, and we don't really fully know what it means for education and for teaching and for learning. I thought maybe I could open the conference with just a little story that, for me, offers a lot of hope. This is a story about my great-grandmother. Her name was Emilia Pihlik. She was born in 1902. At the time, Estonia was part of Tsarist Russia. And if you imagine the world in 1902, at the time, maybe 1 in 5 people around the world could read and write. My great-grandmother, she went to school. She went to school for 4 years, or actually I should say 4 winters. So she learned to read and write. She lived in a small village near Jõhvi, which is about 150 kilometers from here. She did occasionally come to Tallinn, but basically for most of her life she really stayed in that village. And now, if we think about how much, really our country and the world changed in the past 100 years, it's pretty incredible to think about that. Estonia became independent in 1918, and then we enjoyed a little bit over 20 years of independence. In 1939, when the Second World War started, we were occupied, and then for over 50 years we were occupied. We regained independence in 1991. At the time I was 10 years old. I was about to turn 11. And when I finished secondary school, my great-grandmother, she was 96. So imagine everything she had seen. I had the opportunity to go to study at the University of Oxford. So to think that this was possible, it's a bit like a miracle. It would have been unthinkable for my parents, and obviously completely unthinkable for my great-grandmother. So I just thought maybe I can start out by just thanking all of my teachers. I think without my teachers, and obviously without my parents and my family, I would never have had the opportunities that I have. When we talk about contemporary approaches to teaching and learning, then this question is in the air. Not just in Estonia, but around the world. I have been lucky to work for the past 10 years in different education roles in teacher support and also curriculum development around the world. So these same conversations about what sort of teaching and learning do we really need, I've had lots of these conversations with friends and colleagues here in Estonia, but literally all over the world. In rural China, in some of the slums in India with the teachers there, in South America, obviously many European countries, in the US as well. So I think the questions are really important because we don't really know the answer. What sort of teaching practices and what sort of learning should we both use in our classrooms and schools, and what we should promote? And I think it's an urgent question, because until we have a good shared understanding of that, there's a lot of stress for our teachers and for students as well, because they're not really sure what is expected of them. They realize that something needs to change, and partly I think they feel already because of learner engagement. They see the children and the young people that they're teaching, and they see that children find it more difficult to concentrate, for example, because of their exposure to phones and tablets, computers. So something needs to change, but we're not really sure what. I think over the next 2 days, we will be looking at some of the issues about teaching and learning. So from a research point of view, I think we'll have a great opportunity to hear from some amazing researchers from Estonia, from many countries around the world, around Europe as well. So I think it's a small step towards evidence-based education. I don't think we'll have any conclusive answers. I mean, one, because I think a lot of the research actually, there are some contradictions in there. It's not so easy to interpret what it really means. But I hope that we will have a better understanding of the current research, and we'll be able to think what it means for policy as well. So now I'm very happy to introduce our first 2 speakers. So. Our first speaker is Mailis Reps. She is the Minister of Education and Research in Estonia. We're very lucky to have her because she has a lot of experience as a minister. It's the 3rd time she serves in this role, and also because I think she has wide perspectives of education, having obviously studied in Estonia, but also various European countries. And then after that, I'll also just right now also introduce our next speaker. So Ms. Sofia Eriksson-Waterschut. She's a director in the European Commission in the Directorate General for Education, Youth, Sport and Culture. She's from Sweden, and she joined the European Commission in 1996. So thank you very much all for coming to this conference. And now, Mailis Reps, please.
Thank you very much for very kind words for introduction, and I have to tell that it's wonderful to be in a conference which there is a lot of researchers and policymakers discussing what could, should, and maybe we could all learn from that, because normally as a minister you have to give the answers and you cannot start discussing what could, should, or would be done, because then they want to answer yes or no, or how much and how fast. So for a change, it's really wonderful to think together with you. But dear guests, dear colleagues, I do repeat, welcome to Tallinn, welcome to Estonia. I know you have been here all for some time already. It is my pleasure, and of course the honor, to open a presidency flagship conference on education. The role of presidency means, of course, responsibility. But it also is a great chance to get together with education leaders around the continent. We are here in our new cultural center to discuss about the European issues on education and share the best practices. As you see, we are not far from the Old Town, where our first dome school was located in the 13th century. Also, the oldest and from its establishment still functioning school in Estonia, the school founded by the Swedish King Gustav Adolf in 1631, is also located in the Old Town of Tallinn. The fact that there are new schools working side by side with very old ones shows that we respect the long traditions of learning and the heritage of our predecessors. But we also open to everything that could be described as new and innovative. The schools you have visited today are also all very special in their own way, with diverse student bodies, organizational cultures, traditions they follow. It shows that the creative freedom all Estonian schools have, use, and enjoy, but we also considering the social political context they are functioning in, be it in towns or rural areas. But they all are effective and efficient, as their task is to provide all population with compulsory general education and beyond. The other aspect they have in common is that their culture and spirit are built on a true commitment to excellence in teaching and learning. I fully agree to the statement made by outstanding scholar William Pinar: education is a moral enterprise. Accordingly, we have to consider our teachers and academic staff at the universities as distinguished and trusted intellectuals. We deserve every social respect. I hope you have enjoyed your school visits, and I'm sure you will have some food for thought for the conversations during this conference and also back at home. Now it is time to turn to the conference program. The modern world is experiencing turbulent times. Thus, the world of education also has to work hard to respond to constantly emerging challenges globally, regionally, and locally. That means not only all over Europe, but also in our different societies and different communities. My message is to you today is that we should not only focus on adaptation strategies. We should not see education solely as an instrument that helps us to react to the unpredictable changes or compensate for the negative developments outside the education system. We should have a strong vision for education as a driver of desired social change. An easy and convenient way to think about education is how an education system should prepare students for the future, for the best and worst scenarios, for everything unpredictable that could happen in their lives. Current discussions are focusing on addressing mismatching skills and shortages in the labor market, on the short-term returns on investments, efficient use of resources in education, etc., etc. These topics are all relevant, important, but I believe we should take a step forward from here. Education is still expected to lay the foundations for sustainable natural habitats, for peaceful coexistence at a global level, for self-fulfillment of every individual. But it is also expected to contribute to cohesion in all societies of the EU member countries and regions. All countries are striving for becoming knowledge-based, and so is Estonia. But we all needed somewhat different and specifically culturally relevant knowledge as shared values for building up our national identities. There is much talk about developing creativity at different levels. However, there cannot be any creativity without knowledge and skills for basis. There have to be particular knowledge and skills to be used in new ways and in new contexts. That means creativity that can lead to inventions and discoveries, to great artistic works and improvements in human welfare. That is the reason why in many countries, philosophers and educationists have turned especially to the content of education, which can provide people with evergreen past experience, required modern skills, and active approach towards solving upcoming problems. One of our questions should be, how can education take us closer to a cohesion, inclusive, and prosperous Europe? What can we do to help learners, students, teachers, school leaders becoming willing and capable of taking responsibility for positive changes in education, and in particular for the well-being of the world around them? In my opinion, we all have to think more precisely about equal access to high-quality education, creating conditions for all learners to succeed irrespective of their backgrounds. That means supportive learning environments of different kind. One of Estonian experiences is that we have made great use of hidden curriculum. That is a life around us, especially media, museums, public universities, activities, which can greatly support achievements of diverse educational goals. That also means active participation and involvement of different actors, including students, parents, teachers, employers, local communities at large. The modernization of education is the key priority for our presidency agenda. We need to proceed with a discussion on the broader goals of learning, the ways learning takes place and responsibilities of schools, education, learners, parents at different levels. That also means smart distribution of labor and resources. In Estonia, we strongly believe in informed and evidence-based education making. We rely on our pedagogical traditions, but we're also looking for new innovative solutions, often provided by new digital technologies. I hope at this conference we all will share our practical and efficient experience considering all fields, levels, age groups participating in lifelong learning. We all have our success stories to tell, which everybody can learn from. In line with our communications of the Commission on the modernization of higher education and schools, we are leading discussion at the Council level and would like to agree on the Council conclusions with all Member States this coming November. Hopefully, the ideas gained at this conference will inform our further policy debates and help us to finalize the drafts of the conclusions. I wish you all a pleasant stay in Tallinn, fruitful discussions, and let me finish with the words of Doris Lessing. That is what learning is. We suddenly understand something you are understood all your life, but in a new way. Thank you.
Hello, everyone. Dear Minister and dear participants to this conference, I must start by saying that I feel inspired. Just looking around in this contemporary room, I think it fits very well with the theme of the conference, but also with the really inspiring experience I had this morning at the visit in this university at the Center for Innovation in Education. I think there's so much we all can learn from what you do here in Estonia. So let me really start by thanking the Estonian Presidency for choosing the theme, contemporary approaches to learning and teaching, because this is such a crucial topic. And why is it crucial? Well, first of all, I think we all agree we need to provide high-quality education for all learners. And secondly, we need to equip learners with a broad set of competencies to prepare young people and pupils for living in a society and be ready for the world of work. And I think we can also agree that we cannot manage this without thinking and applying excellent and contemporary teaching and learning practices. So the theme is very, very crucial. But it's also crucial, the theme in Estonia, because I think we are all very curious how Estonia manages, how you manage to achieve such excellent results. You are, in the end, one of the top performers in the world. And it's very, again, inspiring, but also it creates curiosity, I think, among all of us, how you do it. So can we learn from this? I'm sure we can. And actually, after this visit this morning, I'm even more convinced how many sources of inspiration you will be able to provide to European context, and of course, even more globally. But I would even go further than learning and teaching, because this is not only important from an education perspective. This is actually fundamental for the future of Europe. And you know, this is really very much what we would like to engage with debates overall. Some of you may have seen President Juncker present his State of the Union speech, where indeed he put forward some personal ideas on the future of Europe. And education is very much part of it. And we know why we need education. Well, it's crucial for the world of work, to have good, well-educated individuals. But we also need to have education to create innovators, for tomorrow. We need education to make young people thrive in this connected society, but also, very important, to create active and engaged citizens, and maybe citizens that also dare to challenge themselves. So luckily, we have this positive momentum at, I think, in many countries, but also at European level, that education is actually very high on the political agenda. And I will cite what heads of state agreed on earlier on this year when they celebrated the 16th anniversary of the Treaty of Rome. It was the Rome Declaration, which says explicitly that the union, we should have a union where young people receive the best education and training and can study and find jobs across the continent. So this is a very, very high and important vision that we have set for ourselves. But of course, we must recognize it's not an easy ride, and there are many challenges that we see across our continent. It's also recognized at European level that we need to do something about it. At the white paper that the Commission put forward also earlier this year, I want to cite two important messages. First, we need a massive investment in skills. And secondly, we need a major rethink of education and lifelong learning systems. So, while we can agree to ourselves, Europe is home to already a lot of innovative practices, we cannot be blind to these challenges. And unfortunately, and there Estonia and maybe one or two other countries are exceptions, but for many of the countries, we were very, I think, was a collective disappointment with the latest or the last PISA results. Because we see there are really too many 15-year-olds who lack the basic levels of reading, mathematics, and science competencies. Too few young people lack adequate digital skills, despite the digital native society we are in. And looking at the adult population, we have about 25% struggling with reading and writing and poor numeracy. And unfortunately, we have gone down, let's say, we have made progress in terms of reducing early school leaving, but still we are not achieved the European target, which to have 10% or less than 10% of young people leaving school prematurely. So there are challenges, many challenges ahead of us. So the challenges are very often common challenges, and I think this is relevant for today. Of course, the solutions are perhaps less often common, and that's in any case not what we strive for. But what we try to do at European level is to bring up these common challenges and see how we can address them together, if we can discuss and find solutions together. And to do that, we hope, at least from the Commission side, we can facilitate providing evidence, we can facilitate learning from each other and create a bit of a peer counseling and peer pressure from each other. Encourage debate, this is important to progress. And simply challenge ourselves, as we also were told today at the Innovation Center. And hopefully by doing this, we can create some small grains of innovation and develop policies that ultimately will lead to better education and training. So, looking at these challenges, this was the reason why the Commission put forward in May this year a package, an education package, a strategy for better, more inclusive and future-oriented education. It was an attempt to put a vision, a European vision, to address the challenges, but also see how we then can support through European cooperation and exchanges in addressing the challenges. This we do, as you know very well, the responsibility for education systems lies with member states. So there's no doubt about that, but the EU has a real duty to support. And for that end, the Commission engages in close work with member states and governments and stakeholders. So let me turn to one part of the package, which is about school education. Here, you will not be surprised to see that it reflects what I said in the beginning. The vision is that we have to provide a high-quality education for all learners, and that we need to provide a broad set of competence for our learners. And I will highlight three main elements that we put forward in this strategy. First of all, schools. well, schools, there are a lot of things to say about schools, but maybe one important comment in this context, also discussed, I think, or will be part of the discussions at the conference, that schools cannot be left alone. Schools need to get support, and they need to be open to new forms of cooperation, be it with parents, families, but with businesses, and of course the local communities. Second main element of this strategy is, of course, key leaders, the teachers. And there's a lot to say about teachers as well, and we will hear again the conference. But not to forget, teaching should be an attractive career choice for the best graduates. It's not yet the case everywhere in Europe today. Schools should be led by inspiring and competent professionals who care for one thing above all, which is to give every child the best possible learning experience. So this is the message. Then the third, to make this happen, of course, you need a good governance culture that actually supports these two previous ones, that supports schools and that supports teachers. And we cannot do this without looking at the money part. So we need proper investment in quality education. And that would mean not only for the primary and secondary part, but again, looking beyond that, what happens before. We need proper investment also for our youngest children. So the early education is very, very key. We also need accountable or governance that allows for accountable schools in a constructive way. So not look at evaluation as some kind of checklist, but really as a way to encourage improvement and development. So this package is to raise, let's say, and encourage the debate for school education, and the Commission is ready, of course, to support Member States in different ways. And you will see some, I hope, good proposals in the text that we will work on in the coming years. But we also had a second part of this education package, and that's more on the higher education side. We have presented a new agenda for modernization of higher education, which sets out as well the challenges or the vision and the challenges that we think we can work on at European level for the higher education sectors. And there we have 4 key objectives. First of all, to make sure that we are able to develop the skills needed, excellent skills that we can get from higher education. But higher education needs to be also more inclusive and, again, more connected. We have to make sure the higher education institutions contribute to innovation. And again, this governance element to make sure that the systems are effective and efficient. And you will see in this proposal that a lot of these actions we propose and the objectives touch upon on the teaching and learning. I can give you some examples. We have proposed, for example, to further use the potential of our Erasmus Plus program to support the pedagogical training of teachers in higher education, and a much more intense use of staff mobility in higher education. Another proposal we are looking at is look at how resources are used within higher education, and actually even within higher education institutions, how is teaching supported and rewarded in comparison, for example, to research. We also want to help future students to make good choices about the study and encourage uptake of some fields that seem more difficult to get the uptake. So you will see a focus on the STEM or the STEAM fields. And the STEAM, I'm happy that I can relate it again to the experience this morning, adding, let's say, an art and design element to the traditional science, technology, engineering, and math element. We saw it this morning that there's a lot of focus on interdisciplinarity, and that I think fits very well with this priority. And finally, we need to understand what happens to students after they finish university. So we put forward a proposal on tracking graduates, and that will hopefully also give information that will improve the learning and teaching of our universities. So this is in the very short lines of the two parts of the education package. Just to say, I'm not here all by myself. I have colleagues from the Commission here at the conference, and we will really follow with great interest the discussions today and tomorrow. And you can be sure that we will use this input in the follow-up to the communications, because obviously this is not something we can do alone. We have to do it together. And I think it may actually inspire us for the thinking we are starting right now to look together how we can cooperate at European level in a 2030 context. So far we have set objectives until 2020, but we have to think a bit more long term. So I think this can inspire us for this. Now, as a last word, let me just mention our dear Erasmus Plus program. I cannot stand here and not mention it, because it's such a wonderful year for the Erasmus Plus. We are celebrating 30 years anniversary of this successful and iconic EU program. And I want to highlight just that we of course, we provide exceptional experiences for all those 9 million actually who have participated since the last 30 years of gaining knowledge, but also learning to become more independent and discover a new country. But we should not forget this other part that the Erasmus Plus can do. It is to encourage partnerships between learning institutions. And we can see that there are a lot of partnerships that have actually been focused on developing teaching and learning practices. So we should build on that and do much more of this in the future. And for the future, we are starting to reflect quite intensively on the future program, or the Erasmus Plus program. And we will have plenty, of course, of discussions and possibilities to hear your views on this as well. But I think I would like to share with you a few ideas we have. First of all, we want the program to become a more accessible and a more inclusive program. I think that's very, very important. We want the program to be as successful as it is for higher education to other sectors. We want the program to be much more ambitious when it comes to school education and vocational education and training, for example. But we also want the program, and that's very relevant for the conference today, we want the program to be really a cross-sectorial program. So we want to encourage partnerships between, for example, a school and a university, between a vocational education training and a school or higher education. Because all the sectors face similar challenges, so we have to work together. So this conference indeed is a good example of this broad approach, as we can say that learning and teaching is truly cross-sectorial. So finally, let me thank again the Estonian Presidency for organizing this, and in this very inspiring and innovative place we're in. I really wish you all excellent debates. But let me finish with a message that I learned this morning at the center here at the university. It's a message to you and for all of us for this conference. It's to let's challenge each other, but also challenge yourself. That's how innovation happens. Thank you.
Thank you so much, both Mailis Reps and also Sofia Eriksson-Waterschott, for your opening remarks. I think you have wonderfully set the tone and the stage for our conference. Maybe just to pick up on the very last comment that you made about challenging ourselves. I think I completely agree with the spirit, and I think it is very important. But I think that's also why I think this whole topic is important, because when we think, you know, in Estonia, for example, teachers on average have more than 20 years of experience. So if we're saying that we have to challenge ourselves and start teaching in a different way, and we need to start thinking about learning in a different way, this is uncomfortable. I mean, it's not easy. I mean, think about, like, when was the last time that you changed your own mind about something really significant? like it's not so simple. So you know, we talk about this and it's very important, but I think it's going to be a long process of making meaning what these new approaches to teaching and learning really mean. And I think it has to be a very engaging process together with teachers, because otherwise I think it's going to be quite difficult and cause a lot of stress. Now, before we move on to our first keynote speaker, I would just like to introduce, we have a couple of short videos that we will be showing to you at the conference today and tomorrow. So there are these very short interviews with 5, I think, amazing individuals. They're all Estonian. They're doing work in different fields. And the question that we ask them is what sort of skills and competencies really, you know, shaped their world and their life. So enjoy the first short video clip.
Mul on olnud üsna palju õnne, et ma olen sündinud just selles kohas maailma muna peal, kus ma olen sündinud, ehk siis Eestis. Ja just sellel ajahetkel, kui ma sündisin, et see on kindlasti olnud väga tugev mõjutus ja hea alus selleks, et tegeleda nende aladega, millega ma tegelen. Üsna noorest peast saadik olen ma tegelenud 2 asjaga, milleks on siis filmindus ja muusika. Vaheldumisi on nad siis nii-öelda oma prioriteetide tähtsuse järjekorras tõusnud või langenud. Ja palju räägitakse seda, et siin kaugel Ida-Euroopas on ikkagi raske pääseda igale poole ja kõik on ilmvõimatu. Aga mulle on just tundunud see kõik vastupidine, et 21-aastaselt tegime sõbraga täispika mängufilmi, mis ma arvan, et ei oleks väga võimalik mitte kuskil mujal maailmas. See on selline tore alguspunkt inimestele, kes tahavad teha, mida iganes nad soovivad teha. Muusikaga on samamoodi, et see kohalike inimeste toetus ja nende pealt õppimine ja suhtlemine ja kogu see olukord siin on andnud piisavalt eneseusku ja motivatsiooni, mis on viinud mu tegemistes siis sinna maani, kus ma praegu olen.
And now it's my great pleasure to introduce our first keynote speaker. And I will just say, you know, until now you've been, you know, sitting very quietly and listening. So hopefully we'll have a lot more audience engagement after this first keynote and also after the next speeches that we will hear. So I would like to introduce Professor Robert Jan Simmons. He is Professor of Educational Psychology at Utrecht University. He has decades of experience researching learning, digital learning, feedback, mindsets, professional learning, assessment of learning, organization of learning, and many other themes that I think are all really relevant to the 2 days and to our conference here. The title of his presentation is Mind Shifts Related to Learning. So we will shortly find out what are mind shifts and why these are important. So the floor is yours, please.
Thank you very much. Ladies and gentlemen, it's a great pleasure to be here. But it is also a difficult experience. This will be the shortest keynote lecture I ever had. And they say that it is because you can only listen 20 minutes to a speaker. And I was thinking, what do we ask from our students most of the days? How many hours are they listening? I want to start my lecture with a short statement from Nelson Mandela. Education is the most powerful weapon which you can use to change the world. I found that so important and so also very fitting this day that I took it with me. Today, I want to tell you something about some experiences I had just before the summer holiday when I was in Iceland. There was a conference called the OEB Summit. For those of you who don't know what OEB is, that is Online Educa Berlin, and it was in Iceland. And it was a summit, because normal OEB is in Berlin and it's in December, but now it was in the summer in Iceland. And the topic was the future of learning in all kinds of settings. And I must say that I learned a lot at this conference. And I took many ideas with me. One idea that I took with me is that change is going fast, much faster than I thought before that. Change is also going faster and faster. There was somebody who was speaking in terms of the speed of speed was increasing. But two things came out of it that in my view are very important and was also kind of evidence-based. Many people in the conference had examples of what the machines are doing, how the robots are taking over all kinds of jobs in the world, and how fast these developments in the robotics are going, and especially combined with artificial intelligence. And the second is that there was Valerie Hannon was a speaker there, and she was very convincing and showing that what we see every day around us in the climate changes is not a coincidence, and we cannot longer ignore it, and we need to act fast as a society, as a world, as a planet. We need to act that fast that we need this weapon of education to be able to do so. So this means that there will be a lot of change, still more change than we already have nowadays in the world of work. Jobs are disappearing, and we see it, for instance, I don't know how it is here, but in the Netherlands, big shops that were always there are now closed because of the internet shops are taking over. The machines and robots are taking over thousands of jobs already, especially in China. And but there's also good news. There come new jobs. You can be not working in a shop anymore, but you can work in the internet, in the web shop. You can have robots and computers taking over your work, but you can also work with them. If you can't beat them, join them. And everybody agrees that we need new skills for the future. And then also the question came up, what is the strength of the human people compared to the robots? What is it that we can add to, or how can we beat the robots? How can we work together with them? And then almost everybody agreed that there are three things very important. It is already mentioned just before, creativity. This will not be a great strength of the robots. And it is empathy, the feeling part, emotional part, and it's critical thinking. Only those three. And then I read this report of the World Economic Forum, and they predict that the top 10 skills, according to employers, are changing over the coming years. And the new top, you see again, critical thinking and creativity, and at the sixth place, emotional intelligence as the most important part. So the lesson from this conference was we should focus in education much more on creativity, critical thinking, and emotional parts, moral parts. What it all means for learning in and outside of school, this was the question I all the time was asking myself while in this conference in Iceland, is what does it mean for learning? And one thing is very clear, we need to learn more. we need to learn faster, because there are so many new things to learn, and we are not very good in skipping things that are now in education and in learning. But of course, we also have to focus much on what we can leave out. But on the same hand, everybody should learn how to learn faster and to learn more. And then there are all kinds of new outcomes of learning that we think of. Already mentioned was the whole digital part. Long time we thought that children will educate themselves in the digital sense. Now we know this is not the case. They need education for their digital learning. And many examples came across where you see how fast it is changing. I will just tell you two examples. One example is being a mechanic in a car in a garage was a job where you worked with your hands. But today already, and tomorrow still more, you are working with computers. You are programming a car in electrical sense. Completely new kinds of job. Then in the surgery room, the nurse in the surgery room within 5 years will be a computer assistant of the surgeon. So we have many things to learn in a very fast way, and we have to learn new and different things. And there's one very awkward thing that we quite well know from our science of learning, is that new outcomes and different outcomes ask for different ways of learning. And this is a fact that is forgotten a lot. You cannot learn to become independent without having the opportunity to learn independently. You cannot learn to be a collaborative learner without having opportunities to collaborate. So, in the new ways we organize learning and for these new outcomes, we need to have all these new ways of learning. Independent learning, collaborative learning, problem-based learning, personalized learning, discovery learning, creative learning, e-learning, and so on and so forth. The ways of learning are changing because the outcomes are changing. So now to the main topic of my lecture, the mindset. I have a very complex definition of a mindset, and I'm the only person who ever defines it, so be happy. Most of the time it's not defined at all. But what is important is that it is a kind of combination of coherent, rather implicit, self-evident assumptions, attitudes and knowledge elements with often an emotional load, but it has one key idea. And if this key idea changes, everything changes. And it is expected to determine behavior of people in groups or individually. And I like to talk about the word mind shift. That is a change in mindset. It's easy. I was first inspired by the work of Carol Dweck. Many of you may know it. If not, I would advise you to read this book. And she made a distinction between the fixed mindset and the growth mindset. In fact, it is, according to my definition, it is a mindset about the mind. She took a kind of combination of the two words. There are very interesting theories about mindsets that do not have to do anything with the mind at all. But in Dweck's work, it is a mindset about the mind. And these two mindsets, fixed and growth mindset, have very, very important consequences. To summarize quickly a lot of research, the growth mindset has the idea, this is the basic assumption, that intelligence and general qualities can be developed. And that they grow through learning and thinking. And that there is, of course, also a heredity. There are also genes, but they only explain part of the variance. And they leave a lot open for learning. And the basic idea, as Dweck now formulates, is you can learn anything. Even if you have a low intelligence, you can learn a lot. Also about intelligence. And the fixed mindset is the opposite. Intelligence and general qualities cannot be developed. They determine what people can learn. So what you could do is look at the highest level people can reach. Do not ask too much of a student, because then there will be frustration or disappointment. And these two ideas have very important consequences. Where is it? Oh yeah, here. People with the fixed mindset react differently to all these kinds of things, to challenges, to obstacles, to effort, and to criticism. In the fixed mindset, you avoid challenges, you give up easily, you see effort as fruitless or worse, and you ignore useful negative feedback. Whereas in the growth mindset, you like challenges, because then you can learn and you can develop. You persist in the face of setbacks. You see effort as the path to mastery, and you learn from criticism. So many very beautiful things are related to this growth mindset. And therefore, research shows that students with a growth mindset perform much better than students with a fixed mindset. And also, teachers and supervisors differ. When they have a growth mindset, they are much more focusing on support. And when they have a fixed mindset, they are much more focused on judgment and evaluation and testing. And then Carl Dweck especially refers to brain plasticity research that supports the idea that the brain can grow, that parts of the brain that are practiced, are exercised and used, develop faster than parts that are not used. So the first mindset shift that I find important for education is the shift from fixed to growth mindset. In general, about 50% of the people have the fixed mindset and 50% have the growth mindset. And we also know a bit how we can do that. It has to do a lot with feedback. Positive feedback works better. It's better to have feedback on effort and not on capabilities or abilities or intelligence. And especially the basic idea is that it is important to have high expectations for all students. Everybody, all students can do better than you believe and than they believe themselves. As a basic idea, you can learn anything. A connected mind shift with this is that this all has to do a lot with our testing system. And so, therefore, it is important that we also realize that apart from the assessment of learning, that is the way we most of the time test in education, where we, after learning, determine and judge and evaluate whether students learned. We need more focus on assessment for learning, where assessment is used to help the learning process, to determine what is already there and what not. Where can you focus the best? How can you inform a student about progress so that he can learn and focus on the parts that are most worth it? And then assessment as learning. That is what, in fact, many times learning is testing yourself. And that's now called assessment as learning. And I think the mind shift number 2 is that we need to focus more on assessment as and assessment for learning. And one problem is that we need to do it then less in a summative way, less of learning, because we cannot make so many tests and so many questions. So we should divide our testings into formative and summative. And then the third mind shift has to do with what I call deep and service learning. This is a PhD by 2 of my colleagues in the Netherlands, and they found that students have different ideas about the essence of learning. Is learning, are you finished when you have reproduced, or is learning deeper understanding? Is it constructing knowledge? Is it constructing meaning? And there were also huge differences between students at different ages and different groups. And they came now back in a recent article by Hattie and Donahue. And the interesting part is that they also focus here on this service and deep learning and transfer learning. But the basic idea they say for today is you need service learning and you need deep learning. And they are both needed. Deep learning builds on service learning. I don't know, and many of my colleagues also disagree that this sequence is important, that it should be first service and then deep. But this is what they say. So the third mind shift is from service to deeper learning. And that is these kinds of things. Deeper understanding, critical thinking, creativity, here they come back again, system thinking, designing, unknown applications, evaluation and judgment, moral thinking, contextualizing, all these kinds of words belong to the idea of we need more deeper learning. And when we bring this together, we found that there are 4 combinations of mindsets. This is the combination of a reproductive mindset with a fixed mindset. This is what I call traditional thinking about learning. It is a performance orientation. It's PISA thinking. Then we have here the move in the direction of higher expectations and growth mindsets. Everybody can do better. Here we have the move in the direction of deeper learning, deeper teaching, where the focus is much more on these deep learning activities. And then the combination is learning to learn in a deeper way. Here it is the teacher who is making it deep, and here it is the student, him or herself, who does it. And I have some of the words that belong to these different 4 squares. And I believe that it is important that we think in these 3 directions. How can we help teachers and students to develop in the direction of a growth mindset, in the direction of deeper learning, and finally, on the long range, how can we really make work of this learning to learn? And because I want to be on time, I finish with the last slide. Because I believe that in all of the discussions about the competences needed for the future, the 21st century skills, we do not focus enough on the learning skills. And in my idea, learning skill is more fundamental even than the other skills for the future of our planet, for the future of our work. And so I hope that we can focus together in the future more on this learning to learn in a deeper way.
Thank you so much, Professor Siemens, for this really interesting talk. You will have an opportunity to ask questions in a second. Do we have 2 microphones? Yes, so maybe think about your questions. I'll just ask the first one, and then please have a think of questions you would like to ask, and then just show with your hands, and then the microphone will be sent to you. So maybe when Professor Siemens is answering my first question, then we can already send the microphones there. It was really interesting. One thing that I wanted to maybe follow up on is your discussion of deeper learning. And I mean, basically, in short, my question is, what do you think, what sort of teaching practices are required to support deeper learning? And the reason why I'm asking this is because I think it's a little bit difficult to interpret like existing data and research on this. I mean, you mentioned PISA. I think, I mean, lots of people obviously criticize it, but I think a lot of people would also agree that in terms of large-scale, robust assessments that assess not only reproduction of knowledge, but also application. So when you apply your knowledge of mathematics or you apply your knowledge of science to new problems, it is sort of the best assessments of problem solving and like creative problem solving that we have. But the countries that do best, you know, including Singapore, South Korea, including Estonia, I think these are countries where actually the teacher-directed, you know, pretty traditional pedagogies are most dominant. Not the only, obviously, there's a mix, but I think these are most widely used. So how to make sense of it? What sort of teaching practices support deeper learning, in your opinion?
Yeah, I'm glad that you touched upon the testing system immediately, because that would be my first answer. We can only focus on deeper learning if we have good deeper learning tests, and we don't. We are just not very good in testing deeper learning. And that's why also in national testing systems and also in PISA, there is some room for the deeper questions, but it's always a small part. And you can get a good mark without deeper learning in many of the tests. And as long as this is the case, teachers and students will never get so far to focus on this deeper learning. So the only way to change the system is change the testing system. And also change from summative to formative testing. Secondly, as I showed in my last figure, there are two ways to do it. The one way is upward, is by organizing these kinds of things. This is really a question of assignments, of questions, of going outside and inside, or it is especially also focusing on, for instance, unknown applications, and most of the time this is happening much better in interdisciplinary projects where you can do a lot of things together and bring things together. But as I said, this is another way to do it. One example I might give, for instance, there's on the internet a set of 12 very, very good ways to teach young students already 6 years of age the essentials of system thinking. And I've seen beautiful videos of it by Peter Senge, who showed that you can teach many of these skills already at a very, very early age. But if you don't do it, they will not discover it on their own. So it is so the second and better way is to make this learning to learn the core of education.
Thank you. So I think we had, where's one of the microphones? If you can just say your name and the organization you represent, and then your question, please.
Hi, my name is Luis. I work for the Learning for Wellbeing Foundation, and I actually have two questions. One is related to individual differences and the starting point, because, for instance, just when you are describing, let's take just the growth and the fixed mindset. If I'm thinking as an educator or as a parent, my child has a particular starting point, and we want to encourage a development towards a particular direction. So how do we deal with these individual differences in terms of the starting points of our students or learners when we are dealing with 20 or 30 people? So that's a typical question, but I'd like to hear what you have to say. Mm-hmm. And the other one, it's more rhetoric to a certain extent. When you were connecting the ways of learning with the outcomes of learning, and you had a list of different ways of learning, you did not include, and I don't think that was on purpose, self-directed. And one of the questions that I ask is, does that mean that we don't want self-directed learners in our current educational school systems? But that may be a bit more philosophical to answer now. Thank you.
As to the first question, we did some very interesting studies where we taught teachers to give feedback in a growth-oriented way to large-scale, large groups. It is possible, but it is very difficult and it takes a lot of time. It is mostly also a question of realization, of critical thinking about what you're doing. And nowadays in my country, there are many projects where people help teachers to give other kinds of feedback, to leave the red pencil and to have a more growth-oriented, positive way of giving feedback to students, especially the students who are themselves thinking low of themselves, who are expecting nothing, who are expecting that they will never succeed. Because it is the expectation of the students, that is what the focus point is of this feedback and of this what we should do. And I think we have been able to show that it is possible. But this asks, in the first place, that people realize how important it is and that you can do it. Then, let me be clear, it is not an easy job to do. It is also not something that an individual teacher can do. It is something a school as a total should do, and where teachers should help each other, and where students should help teachers. My favorite project is a school where the children were taught about growth and mindsets and gradually became correctors of their teachers. Hey, mister, you said that I couldn't learn it. The second question was about self-regulated, no, you said self-directed learning. I call it self-regulated learning here and independent learning. So it's perhaps better to use the word self-directed also. But it has been my main research focus. So probably because of that, I left it out.
Thank you. We just have time for one quick question and quick answer, please. Thank you.
Julian Stanley, European Training Foundation.
Where are you?
I'm here. Really quickly. The European Commission has recently been reviewing what are called key skills. And key skills are the sort of transverse generic skills. Mm-hmm. These were introduced in 2006. And there's been some progress in quite a lot of them. But the single key skill where progress is least good in terms of both policy development, curriculum development, and practice is learning to learn. Mm-hmm. Performance in that is considerably below all of the other key skills.
Yeah.
So is it desirable but impossible to achieve? I mean,
I think it is desirable and very difficult to achieve, and perhaps we didn't try the right ways yet. I've never seen good learning-to-learn programs. What I see is always focus on surface learning. What I see is on memorization skills, and that's not really the important part. As I would say, these are the things that, and some of them we know quite well that you can train them. For instance, my example of system thinking and also critical thinking, there are also good projects showing that can work out. I would say that creativity is the most difficult part. And then one thing about key skills is the idea that you have an abstract skill and that it automatically will transfer to all kinds of situations. I know, being a student of transfer, that transfer is not working in this way. Transfer is something you have to work very hard for, and you have to make all connections explicitly. And you cannot just install some general skills and then expecting that it will be used generally. And that's why it has such huge consequences for education, because then you should do everything, all of these things in everything.
Thank you so much. If you want to join me in thanking Professor Simmons. Thank you. We shall now move on to our second keynote speaker. He's also a professor. So it reminds me, there is a famous academic here in Estonia. He's very distinguished and has a proper beard. So the first time I met with him, I say what my name is, and the first question he asked me, so what is the theme of your PhD thesis? I felt, I was not enrolled in a PhD program, so I did not have a PhD thesis. Anyway, so we have our second professor of the day, not the last. So Professor Michael Thomas, we're very grateful and excited to have you here. Professor Thomas is the director of the Center for Educational Neuroscience at the University of London. This is a cross-institutional research center which aims to advance translational research. So from neuroscience to education, and then support the development of practical applications as well in education. So from neuroscience to education. You can see the title of his presentation. I will just very quickly point out before you start that we also have a couple of artists here today with us from an Estonian company called Joon Media. So we have Siiri Taimla and Kati Orav, so they will be visualizing some of the key ideas that are shared at the conference. I remember some of the work I have previously done with problem solving, and for young children to make sense of complicated ideas, it's very helpful to visualize. So we're really happy to have you here, and you'll be able to take a look at it after our sessions as well. But with that, please, the floor is yours.
Many thanks for that introduction, and it's a pleasure to be here today at this exciting conference. So I'm going to start off with some puzzles, mainly things that keep me awake at night. So why do I forget French vocabulary, Russian vocabulary, Latin vocabulary, all sorts of vocabulary, but not that I'm afraid of spiders? Why do I find I've learned things better after a night's sleep? Why do teenagers start making risky decisions to impress their friends, the kind of risks that they wouldn't have taken when they were younger children? Why does my mind go blank when I'm stressed in an exam? Hopefully not during a talk. Why do I learn a new language so much more easily when I'm 5 than when I'm 50? Now, the interesting thing about all of these is the answers come from the particular way the brain works. If I was working for Google and I wanted to build a learning robot, I could build the robot without any of these strengths or limitations. So I could just plug in my phone, recharge it. It wouldn't change the learning whatsoever. Okay, so increasingly we're thinking that some of the answers to questions about how we learn and why we behave the ways we do will come from an understanding about how the brain functions. So it's a big question. How does the brain function? How does the brain develop in ways that are meaningful for education? And we're increasingly beginning to think that what was a plausible model for how the brain works, the desktop computer, that's not really how the brain works. How does the brain work? Well, that is the objective of a particular discipline called cognitive neuroscience, the understanding of brain mechanisms as they are relevant to the workings of our mind. And this is the integration of education and neuroscience is an area of increasing interest. There's, for perhaps 20 years, been an increasing pace of breakthrough findings on learning mechanisms in the brain. And the idea is perhaps it's now the time to think about how we can try and translate these findings into implications that are relevant for education. So we've seen a growth in journals, new journals starting up, new learned societies. We've seen reports come out. Here's a report from the Royal Society in the UK, Neuroscience Implications for Education and Lifelong Learning. There are target review articles in journals such as Nature, Neuroscience and Education, Prime Time to Build the Bridge. Bridge is a metaphor that often comes up for this enterprise. Neuroscience and Education, an ideal partnership for producing evidence-based solutions to guide 21st century learning. And we're also beginning to see an increase in graduate programs in educational neuroscience. In the United States, this approach is called mind, brain, and education. So programs at Harvard, various other universities around the world, Johns Hopkins, and University of London, where I'm based. So the learning sciences have been around for a long time. The traditional interaction has been between education and psychology. The new learning sciences are trying to become more integrative, more interdisciplinary, trying to integrate findings from machine learning and from neuroscience. And indeed, those two integrate themselves in an understanding of neural activity as a form of computation, albeit different from the types of computation that go on in your desktop computer. There are multiple methods in state-of-the-art cognitive neuroscience. Much of them have been enabled by new brain imaging techniques. So we see the brain scanner, magnetic resonance imaging, that can show us things about brain connectivity, about brain structure and how it changes with age, and about the parts of the brain that work harder when we're carrying out certain types of activities. Below a certain age, it's quite hard to ask children to sit still in a scanner. It's very important that they don't move when their brain is scanned. So other techniques are used with younger children. For instance, we can attach electrodes to their scalp, and the electrodes can detect tiny voltage changes as a marker of underlying brain activity. There are even uses of very gentle, direct stimulation, generally not in children, mostly in adults, to see if we can enhance or attenuate certain types of brain activity and seeing their consequences, as well as other dynamic methods such as measuring eye gaze and even having contingent displays that will measure eye gaze and change the nature of the display in response to the eye gaze. So there are multiple methods. I haven't included here the more biological, molecular level of mechanisms and the use of animal models and integration with genetics. So there's a big wave of research coming from neuroscience, but of course we have to be cautious in the translation of that for educational implications. There is a risk of premature translation without an appropriate evidence base. Sometimes this is referred to as neuromyths in education. Ideas like there are left brain people and right brain people, or that there are learning styles, or that we're only using 10% of our brain when we think. All of these are myths. I take these myths in a sense as positive, that teachers are enthusiastic that neuroscience is going to be relevant for their practice, that they're looking for some kind of deeper truth about the mechanisms underpinning the way their children are thinking and developing. So how does one respond to neuromyths? Well, this was one response that a group of academics, researchers from education and neuroscience set about in the UK. This is a letter written to the Guardian newspaper in the UK, where the letter said, look, there's no evidence to back the idea of learning styles. So learning styles is the idea that children or adults have a preferred learning style, visual, auditory, kinesthetic. Indeed, people can reliably indicate what their preferences are, but the evidence base shows that there is absolutely no effect on learning outcomes of giving children materials in the modality for which they have expressed a preference. Okay, so the evidence base just isn't there for learning styles, and yet it appears a lot in materials directed at teachers. So, as these authors said, one way forward is to draw attention to practices that are not evidence-based, and to encourage neuroscientists and educationalists to promote the need for critical thinking when evaluating the claims for educational benefits supposedly based on neuroscience. So the broader picture here is that the adoption of neuroscience attempts to translate it into a mechanistic level of understanding. It is consistent with the broader move to evidence-based approach to education. And there are increasing development of resources in different countries to try and build up an evidence base of what kind of techniques work and what kind of techniques have no evidence base at the moment. So here's an example of one of them in the UK from the Education Endowment Foundation, the Teaching and Learning Toolkit. It has a list, alphabetical list of various activities in the classroom. So here, arts participation, aspirational interventions, behavioural interventions, and so forth. And it will rate them according to things such as cost. How much does it cost to implement these? What is the evidence strength that there's actually a benefit, and what size is the benefit? And what is the impact here encoded in learning months? How much would the technique advance in terms of children's months of learning? And the idea of these evidence-based resources is to try and empower teachers to go out there and be able to decide for themselves, teachers, head teachers, local education authorities, about what kind of techniques it's economic and worthwhile to invest in. Here's another such resource, one in the US, the What Works Clearinghouse. I think there's a set of reading interventions there, and again, similar evaluations on the evidence that supports them. In the UK, we've been fortunate that some of our funding bodies have directed resources towards interventions and new learning techniques that have been inspired by neuroscience. So I think it was 4 years ago now, the Education Endowment Foundation and the Wellcome Trust funded 6 large-scale projects. The first of them is to investigate teen sleep, the importance of sleep and the timing of study for teenagers. Learning counterintuitive concepts, I'm going to talk about that in a moment. Fit to study, the effects of aerobic fitness on children's ability to learn. Space learning is a project in investigating the regime of presentation of material and repetition of the material on learning. Engaging the brain's reward system is a project looking at how motivating feedback can be best tailored to give children the best learning outcomes. In particular, the power of probabilistic rewards rather than deterministic rewards for good performance. And Graphogame Rhyme is an intervention looking at enhancing children's learning of the relationship between letters and sounds across different languages. So I'll focus on one of these, learning counterintuitive concepts. And I'm going to give you an example of a project I'm involved in at the University of London, which is developing a classroom activity based around a computer program to improve science and maths learning in primary age 8 and 10-year-olds at the moment. So first, a bit of a quiz in case you've fallen asleep. This is an easy starter for you. Does the sun go around the earth, or does the earth go around the sun? Can't see in here, you're going to have to guess. No? Okay, well, hopefully that is easy. Earth goes around the sun. Despite the fact that if you went outside and had a look up, it really does look like the sun goes around the earth. It does for kids, right? Is the earth flat or round? I've given you a clue on the previous slide. It looked kind of round, didn't it? But every time you look out of the aircraft window, it kind of looks flat. And if you're a 6-year-old kid playing football on a football field, it kind of looks flat, doesn't it? Is a dolphin a fish? And there's the dolphin in the middle. It's not a fish, it's a mammal, but it kind of does fishy things, lives in fishy places. Falling objects, nice. This is for the physics teachers. If there is no air resistance, which will fall faster, a hammer or a feather? Any answers? Same, yeah, you're feeling pleased with yourself that you spotted the trick question there, but I'll bet none of you have ever seen that happen. Just for your benefit, I went onto YouTube, and here's an Apollo astronaut with a hammer and a feather, and here's when he drops them, and I don't know whether you can see, went on to fractions there. We'll go backwards, we're going to drop them again, and you can see they do in fact hit the moon, if not the earth at the same time. Okay, let's do quick some fractions. True or false for these ones? 1/3 and 1/4 equals 2/7. No, it's not true. It seems kind of plausible. What's that line doing in the middle anyway? True or false? 1/10 is less than 9/100. That's not true, is it? Although it's really kind of tempting that 9 and 100 are bigger numbers, aren't they? Down the bottom, -5 is less than -1. True or false? That's true, but kind of 5 is bigger than 1. Haven't you been told that an awful lot in class? Angle G is the same size as angle H. There we are. Angle G, same size as angle H. True or false? It is true, but G kind of looks... Oh, I'm going backwards. G does look... I can't work this guy anymore. It does look bigger, doesn't it? Just the way I've drawn it. Okay. So I'm trying to trick you with a lot of these examples. But the point here is that in learning maths and science, it sometimes involves inhibiting what you already know, your intuitive experience, or even some of the direct perceptual information that you're seeing in order to acquire the new knowledge you're given. And brain imaging has demonstrated that as students get better at learning these kind of scientific concepts, they are improving their inhibitory skills. Now, what's important about this suppression or inhibition of irrelevant information is you can't see it going on in behavior. This is something you need brain imaging to see going on. And I'll just give an example. This is a study of giving teenagers, I think, these types of problems, and you can see which areas in red light up a little more. And then these are some standard tasks that are assessing what's called inhibitory control. So in this one, you're shown a sequence of symbols, and you're only supposed to press a button at the heart, but not the circle. It's called a go, no, go. So it's all about deciding when to respond. This is what's called the Stroop task. You have to read out the color of the ink. It's really hard because the words get in the way. That's red, black, yellow, blue, green. I'm really struggling with that. But the point here is that when you get individuals, teenagers in the scanner to do these kind of things, you find similar areas lighting up. The better they are at these, the more the areas activated during these two become co-activated as well. So what that led to is the development of a learning activity. This is again aged at the primary age, called the Unlock Project, where we are developing a kind of game show setting where children interact with it. I'll just show you a couple of stills from that for time. But the idea is to present problems which may or may not be counterintuitive, and throughout you're encouraging the children to stop and think. Stop and think when they before they make their decision. Remember to stop and think about your answer. And this is not, in this program, we're not trying to teach people the content. All of the examples are drawn from the syllabus, but it's to train these other kind of skills in what's called executive function or behavioral regulation. Okay, so I'm focusing on mechanisms of learning and what neuroscience can tell us about that. But it's often been pointed out to me that learning is only a small part of education, which did come as a surprise. But here are some other parts. So it's a big enterprise. There are issues about the teaching profession. There are issues of syllabus design. There is the organization, administration of schools. There are societal influences. There are links to employment, links to the criminal system, and links to law, and so forth. So one has to think about, even if you're focusing on mechanisms, you are part of a bigger picture. I'll finish off with a couple of examples about going down to this level here, thinking about societal influences. And one of them is to look at some of the new neuroscience research in the effects of socioeconomic status on brain development. And this is a demonstration here of looking at the amount of cortical surface area against income. So how expanded the brain is, and finding that above about $50,000 family income. It's not much of a relationship, but right down at the bottom here, with a family income below $5,000 a year, you're seeing less cortical surface area. And it's particularly in the areas of the brain responsible for behavioral regulation and for language development. These are skills where we see strong effects of socioeconomic status. Now, the neuroscience approach doesn't just look at these correlations, but it attempts to understand the causal model about how this environmental influence would lead to changes in educational outcomes, and it tries to pull apart potential causal factors. So, for example, you can think of prenatal factors, perhaps stress or diet. You can think of parental care, the early years, about how caregivers are interacting with children and scaffolding the development of early skills, as well as the overall level of cognitive stimulation, the richness of the environment, how many books, how many museum trips, and so forth. And this type of approach suggests different possible interventions. Of course, what you should be doing is trying to get rid of differences in your society, but in the meantime, you can see if there are particular avenues here where you can effectively intervene to ameliorate outcomes. And you can produce very specific recommendations for policymakers on that basis. I won't read all of that out. A couple of other projects going on in my centre at the moment that we're involved in. One of them is looking at the effects of mobile phone use in teenagers. So this is technology. This is something that's hugely changed. We're doing a longitudinal study to look at executive function, language development across the teenage years and the effect, the extent to which it's correlated with types of mobile phone use. We can go earlier. Within 5 years, we went from almost no toddlers playing with tablets to almost all toddlers playing with tablets. What is that doing to their brain? How is that changing their development? We are also engaged in a project which is mainly questionnaire-based at the moment, directed at parents to understand about how their young children are using tablets, the particular contexts in which they use them, and whether there are any correlations, for example, with their motor skills. They get better. Sleep gets worse. Okay. So just to finish off, what are the likely outcomes of this approach of trying to translate from neuroscience to education? First of all, it's one element in a wider evidence-based approach to education. Secondly, it's not in any sense the neuroscientists telling teachers this is what you should be doing. Teachers know much more about what goes on in the classroom than neuroscientists ever will. It's more, if you think of a model where there are organizations undergoing medical research, doing medical research, finding out new drugs, new cures, and they offer those to doctors as possible treatments that would be available, and then it's for the doctor to decide which treatments are appropriate for their particular patients. So I think this approach may lead to a revolution eventually, but like public health, it will be the accumulation of many small effects. In medicine, we had vaccination, penicillin, huge effects. I don't think there'll be that many of those, but I think a gradual accumulation will eventually produce a revolution in education. And many thanks for your attention.
Thank you so much for a fascinating presentation. I realize we're running a bit behind time. Do we have a couple of quick questions from the audience? Please say your name, organization, and your question briefly.
Yeah, I first tried to stand up, but my name is Aune Valk. I come from the Ministry of Education and Research here in Estonia. My question is, I mean, you ended your speech with the example from the medicine. And just last week we had this discussion, why so few innovations or what I find in research are applied in education. And we came to the point that in education we don't have this kind of R&D and research and development activities what are happening in medicine, that somebody is making a discovery about new medicine, and there is a whole process taking 10 years. Somebody's testing it and so on. Why this haven't happened in education? We came to the conclusion that it's a matter of money, but maybe you have another answer.
Yeah, I don't have another answer. is the short answer. Yeah, I'm curious about why an evidence-based approach should have been an innovation in education. Having come to this from cognitive neuroscience, from psychology, it is a source of puzzlement to me. I'm sometimes asked what are the direct policy implications of this approach. And really the first policy implication is to do with teacher training, to encourage teachers to take a kind of curious evidence-based approach and to be interested in mechanism, why their children are behaving, why they are, where the differences come from, and for teachers to be interested in doing research in their own classroom. I think while there's a bottleneck of translation from research, often it's viewed as policymakers about, well, the research, we keep paying for the research, but it doesn't seem to be having any effect on the actual teaching practice. So I'm going to enthuse about neuroscience and education, but I'm aware that there's been 100 years of psychological research which has produced very solid evidence based about, say, the types of memorization techniques that do and don't work. And not all of those have translated into the classroom. So the translation per se is a hard part, and I think that's why this can't just be research that goes on in laboratories. It has to be about the dialogue between researchers and with teachers and with policymakers.
Is there another quick question? I have lots of questions, but just because I know we're behind time, I mean, maybe we can continue the conversation during the coffee break, which is going to be after the next keynote speech. So let's thank Professor Thomas for this presentation. Thank you. Thank you. And now it is my great pleasure to introduce our next keynote speaker. Eva Kikas is also professor of school psychology here at Tallinn University. I'm really excited about her presentation for a couple of reasons. In one, they have studied the same cohort of children over a long period of time, which I think is quite unique. And I think also when we talk about different approaches to teaching and student-centered and teacher-directed, then sometimes this is presented as like either or. Should we just do one or the other? But I think your research is really interesting in helping us understand when, depending on contextual factors, to use one or the other. So thank you very much, and look forward to your presentation.
Thank you very much. Dear colleagues and guests, as we heard already, rapid changes in today's world place greater learning demands both to children and adults. And new problems demand new types of knowledge and skills. And today's schools require different values and teaching practices. Still, I think that we should not abolish everything that has worked well in education and rush with many new reforms that often create unnecessary stress to our students, teachers, and parents. And it's really a great honor for me, but also a great challenge to be here and to introduce our studies where we have examined adaptive and non-adaptive teaching practices in Estonia. But I start a bit from wider context. Of course, we are very proud of our students' excellent performance in PISA tests throughout these years, both in math, language, and science. Actually, we were greatly surprised last May when it was announced that Estonian students, besides good skills, also reported to be satisfied with school. So their well-being turned out to be quite high. Earlier studies had shown that they are quite stressed and burnout is high and motivation is low. So Estonia belongs to positive example countries in international comparison. And here is the results for science showing that the achievement is high and satisfaction of learning is also high. Of course, as it was also already asked before as well, we want to know why. How did it happen? What are the keys for success? Educational outcomes depend on different areas, and for sure, child, home, and classroom. Are our children bright? Do they work hard? Are they motivated? Are our families supportive and value education? Do we have good teachers and schools, and teachers have good teaching skills, and so on? For sure, I do not have all the answers, and I guess nobody has. But I have some hypotheses about the factors that may play a role in this success story. And certainly, I would stress there is no one reason and there is no one practice that is the best, but also combination. I will still start with some historical facts. Estonians have valued education, but also obedience and hard work for decades and even more. Our widely used proverb states that child speaks when chicken pisses, where, as you know, chicken never pisses. And there are several proverbs about persistence and drill to be good in successful in life. Well-known citation from our novelist Anton Hansen Tammsaare in his Truth and Justice said, "Work hard and labor, the love will follow." Also, teacher-directed education and educational classroom practices were widely used during Soviet period. Still, our parents and families valued education, and university education was valued over vocational. To come now a bit edging closer to today, after regaining independence, great societal changes have taken place, including educational sphere. And together with changes, controversies and heterogeneity always grows. It is easier to change conscious thoughts and beliefs than beliefs and attitudes that are acquired during childhood and sometimes unconsciously. But still, these beliefs guide our practices, even if we don't know about them. Thus, abrupt changes in education have caused confusion, stress, and we can also see gaps between written documents, thoughts, and practices. For instance, the controversies were visible in Teaching and Learning International Survey TALIS. Namely, it was found that Estonian teachers conceptualize learning as constructivist, but they tend to apply teacher-directed activities. The same was visible in our study with primary teachers' math beliefs and practices. In reality, of course, the picture is much diverse. Traditional and democratic values, teacher and student-centered activities are visible to different extent in different classrooms. However, this variety provides a good context for researchers. Due to this variety, we could examine which combinations of practices are more supportive than others. And also, can we talk about generally supportive practices, or is their value related to learning context? And now I turn to our longitudinal kindergarten school study. We started in kindergarten and followed children throughout basic school till the end of 9th grade. So here is the design of the study with all these testing points. We studied children, their parents, and teachers. And moreover, we used different study methods like tests, questionnaires, interviews, and observations. So, fortunately, we found heterogeneity in classroom. And now my main emphasis further on is how children develop in classrooms with different teaching practices as examined by observations. So the structure is different, but we also found heterogeneity in practices. We used the observational tool ECOM, developed by Stibek and Weiler, and it differentiates between 3 types of practices. And the teacher gets a score on all these 3 types. Teacher-directed practices are those with high teacher control. Teachers praise students, but they also like to make learning into smaller pieces and to like repetition, and they repeat a lot in these classrooms. They offer instructional support, but much less emotional and autonomy support. Child-centered practices emphasize children's autonomy. Students are provided with tasks that enable active knowledge construction. Teachers value cooperation, provide instructional feedback, emotional feedback, and autonomy feedback. With child-dominated practices, teachers give much freedom, provide little guidance and support, but they are still responsive to students' answers and demands. Our validation studies we have done together with Finnish colleagues. But now about Estonian classrooms. We really found diversity. And here, this blue line shows the amount of child-centered practices in classrooms. And the classrooms are lined up according to the amount of these practices. So I can say that differently what we expect and what we heard before, at least in primary classrooms, teachers do not use teacher-directed practices in the majority of classrooms. But about in half of classrooms, we see they use child-centered practices. Still, this red line is for teacher-directed practices, which are used also mainly used in some classrooms. And child-centered practices, yellow line, are also used in few classrooms. As I said, this diversity enables to analyze which kind of practices are more adaptive than others. And we have done studies on reading and math in grades 1 till 3 with quite similar results. So these are results for reading. And the results are on classroom level showing, and it is in grade 1, they show that the more teachers use child-centered practices, the best reading fluency and reading comprehension children show in the end of first grade, even if the initial skills are taken into account. And quite oppositely, the more teacher-directed teaching they use, the lower the reading comprehension is. However, what is also very informative is that teachers tend to use more teacher-directed teaching in classrooms where initial reading fluency was lower. Actually, the results for math are quite similar, so I sum up the findings. The results of multi-level modeling showed the benefits of child-centered practices and problems with too much emphasis on teacher-directed practices. Moreover, teachers tend to believe that children with lower skills levels need teacher-centered teaching, However, in reality, it does not work. In addition to these dimensions, we also studied styles, combination of dimensions. And according to latent profile analysis, we find 4 styles in grade 1 and 5 styles in grade 3. And what we found is that children showed the best results in classrooms where teaching style was either child-centered or in grade 3 also combination of child-centered and teacher-directed practices. And the results were the lowest in classrooms with child-dominated style. It means too much freedom. We also tried to analyze together practices and classroom context. And I provide example from social sphere about aggression. Namely, we differentiated between 2 types of classrooms with low initial victimization score and with high victimization score. And these figures show that children in classrooms with high victimization score benefit when they learn in classrooms with child-centered, no, I can't get, back. With child-centered teaching as compared to teacher-directed teaching. But what is maybe most interesting, children in low victimization classrooms benefited when the teachers were high in child-dominated style dimension. So child domination is not always bad as well. Maybe it could be understood from earlier results. My last slides are about our latest analysis. And we studied math development throughout elementary school or throughout basic school. And according to latent profile analysis, found 5 clusters. The majority of children learning being in high skills group throughout the school years, but also children with low skills throughout school period. Now I skip individual differences which were in expected direction. For me, what was quite surprising, but of course in line with my previous speech, classroom-related characteristics. We found that children in this low-skill group had teachers who showed teacher-directed practices more than child-centered practices when compared to other groups. And even more, we also asked teachers about their teaching practices. And in accordance with observational study, we also found that these teachers stated that they use behavioral control more than teachers in other classrooms. So, to conclude, the advantages of Estonian students may be related to the combination of traditional and new values in our society and teacher and student-centered practices. Both activities are important, and the key seems to be in the context-related combination. Earlier, I showed only part of the citation by Anton Hansen Tammsaare. It was father's part, who told that you must work hard, and then love comes. Actually, the son also answered, and he stated that although his parents had worked hard, love never came. Our studies also showed that students need feelings of autonomy and understanding, teacher emotional and instructional support. So it means that really something else is needed besides hard work. Our studies also referred to misconceptions. The belief that low-skilled students need teacher direction. Our findings do not support that. To the contrary, they indicate that just child-centered practices or the combination with teacher-directed practices are the most supportive. However, the opposite, high freedom and independence, is also not adaptive in low skill level and high problem behavior classroom. However, it may be supportive in classrooms with high skill level and low problem behavior. I didn't talk about high skills, but we have other studies related to this as well. So everybody needs autonomy and challenges, but their meaning differs between students and classrooms. And I would say that research can provide directions, but teachers and also policymakers should possess the wisdom to translate research into practice. So, thank you.
Thank you so much, Professor Kikas, for this really interesting presentation. We're a bit behind schedule, but do we have a couple of quick questions from the audience, please? If you have a question, maybe you can show us with your hand. Maybe I'll ask one really quickly. So I found it interesting that John Hattie and others have basically published and talk about these meta-analysis of teacher-direct instruction versus more child-centered approaches, and their conclusion from decades of looking at lots of research studies, basically they conclude that teacher-direct is better, and I think you're providing some more nuance. I mean, how do you interpret what they are saying and the fact that actually your studies seem to contradict what they're saying?
I absolutely agree that learning facts and definitions and basic skills is important in school. And teacher-directed education is aimed at these skills. But I am also sure, and our findings also refer, that motivation and the feeling of autonomy, starting from quite in the beginning, is the key if we want our children to persist not only in elementary grades but afterwards as well. And our studies really show that child-centered education with combinations is the best. And I absolutely agree that this is the hardest way. It is the hardest way how to combine these practices, taking into account whole classroom level, individual children, and so on. But it's the art of teaching.
Yes, thank you. Okay, there's one quick question. Just you will have the microphone in a second. Please say your name and your organization.
Joke van der Leeuw, Euroclio, European Association for History, Citizenship and Heritage Education. I think that your last remark is extremely important for what we are talking about here. That research can give directions, ideas, but that they cannot solve what we actually are talking about. What we see here is interesting research, which is absolutely important to get information about. But at the same time, sometimes it's very contradictory. And quite often press takes away some of the researches, brings it over to everybody as an absolute research result. And I was very happy with your last remark that we have to be very conscious that we can have your directions, but not directly the way how we can solve it. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much for this comment. And I would like to add that in education we can't dream for quick solutions. It's a very complicated area and needs much thinking.
Well, if you could all join me in thanking Professor Rebekikas. Now it's time for a coffee break. Just before you go, a couple of very quick announcements. So we will have 3 breakout sessions right after the coffee break. You will have information in your materials about the sessions. The first breakout session will be in this room. So this will be about mainly about skills and vocational education. The theme is learning environment which is supportive of students' transition from one level of schooling to the next and developing skills throughout life. So if you're interested in that one, please come back here. Directions to the other 2 breakouts, there are signs, and also our colleagues who are organizing this conference will be able to direct you to the two others. So there's going to be one breakout session about learning in schools and engaging external stakeholders and how to do that meaningfully. And then the 3rd breakout session is more about teacher support and higher education, the expectations and roles of students and learners from the new generation. I thank everyone for the presentations. As a moderator, I feel we've run a little bit over time, and it's very hard to pick up like the main threads of the conversation. I think the main question for me, just thinking about our audience, we have nearly 200 people here, and I think question is really, what does this all mean for policy, and how can we ensure that we have clear objectives in mind in terms of what we want children and young people to learn, but how is this also aligned with supporting teacher development and competencies, curriculum, learning materials, and assessment? Because I think right now, 1, I think sometimes there is confusion about what we really want, and 2, these key pieces really are not necessarily always in alignment. But hopefully we'll be able to explore this later on today, and then tomorrow. I'll also just mention, because we are behind schedule a little bit, let's start the breakout sessions 10 minutes later. So you will have a coffee break now for half an hour. So it's 3:10 right now. So let's start the next sessions at 3:40. And if the speakers could meet at each of the rooms and just go over the details of the next session, but otherwise everyone else, if you can join the sessions at 3:40. Thank you.
Please come closer to the screens. I mean, this is a very common Estonian trait to hide somewhere far back of the of the conference center, preferably where nobody can see you. But yes, the first row is almost empty. Please join us here. Well, I think we are running already a bit behind schedule, even without starting. So, good afternoon to everybody. My name is Janno Järve. I'm from Estonian Center for Applied Research Center, and this is my privilege to be a moderator of this session. We have had a very interesting day so far, with starting with visits to Estonian schools. I hope you all enjoyed them. At least for me, even being from Estonia, it was quite interesting. And of course, followed by very interesting excursions to the topics like mindsets, mind shifts, and educational neuroscience. So we are not going to conduct MRI scans here today in this session, but I'm quite sure the topics we will discuss will also be quite interesting. And I'm very glad that you decided to join us. During the next 1.5 hours, we will ponder on the topic of what elements of educational institutions help to create supportive learning environments and foster transition from one level of schooling to the next, and of course contribute to the development of skills throughout our lives. When it comes to education, a body of research shows that early intervention is the best. And maybe it's because of that primary and secondary level of education have received relatively large amounts of attention, while when we speak of upper secondary education systems, they are maybe not that important, or that prominent research topics, or have not been, at least so far. So it is the aim of this session to give our humble contribution to correct for that. We have 3 very interesting presentations waiting for us, and I will not waste any more time with long introductions. We will start from a more aggregate level and look at which education systems support more equal and effective acquisition of skills at a later age. Our first speaker is Andy Green, a professor of comparative social science at Center for Learning and Life Science Changes in Knowledge Economies and Societies, led by University of London. Professor Green, the floor is yours.
Okay, thank you, Anna, for the introduction and for organizing our session. It's a pleasure to be here for this conference in Tallinn. My presentation today is about the effects of upper secondary education and training systems on skills inequality. And I'm referring to inequality of skills as measured by tests for numeracy and literacy competencies in PIAC. This is based on work I've done with a colleague, Nick Pensiero, in our Lake Centre in London. And it's primarily drawing on the data from the Survey of Adult Skills, a very rich data set, cross-country data set. We're only focusing on the data on literacy and numeracy. I think it's true to say that we know quite a lot about the effects on skills inequality of primary and lower secondary education systems. And that research suggests that more unequal outcomes are likely to occur in countries where there is early selection to different tracks or types of school, where there's a high proportion of privately funded schools, a lack of standardization in curricula and assessment, and in federal systems where funding is devolved to the regional level. We know a lot less, and I think you were indicating this, Jana, in your introduction, about upper secondary education systems and how they impact on skills inequality. So that's what we're focusing on in this piece of research. What we do know, though, is that there's a significant variation across countries in degrees of skills inequality. This graphic, now again, this is taken from the PIAC data. This shows you the difference in mean numeracy and literacy scores between the top and bottom quintiles of 25 to 29-year-olds. And immediately you can see that there's quite a lot of variation across countries, particularly in numeracy, which is in blue, and notably England and the US and Norway at this age have quite high, quite wide dispersal of skills. Japan and Korea and the Russian Federation and Estonia are at the other end with a relatively narrow dispersion of skills. You have to take probably the Russian Federation data with a bit of caution because Moscow had to be removed from the sample, which may affect the skills dispersion measures. If you look at country groups, and this is simply taking the averages of the mean scores of the differentiation for the countries in each country group, you can see that the country group with the highest variance in scores are the English-speaking countries, and particularly England and the United States. The East Asian countries on this Gini measure of skills have the least differentiation. The rest of the groups are relatively closely clustered in the middle. We also have data on parental occupation in PIAC, so we can look at the social gradients for numeracy for younger and older age groups. So this is about the impact of social background on skills levels. And you see there's also quite a lot of interesting country variation here. Again, the East Asian countries have relatively low social gaps or small social gaps in skills. So does Cyprus, and so does the Russian Federation on these figures. Rather larger social gaps are evident with the Slovak Republic and in England and in Northern Ireland. And in between, there's some differentiation, particularly amongst the older group, but this is ranked in terms of 16 to 24-year-olds. And in terms of the same country groups again, the social gaps in competence in these areas, particularly for these younger ones, are the highest in the English-speaking countries, particularly in the US and the UK again. And again, the East Asian countries have the least inequality on this particular measure. The others, again, are quite closely clustered. So where do we start from? What can existing theory tell us about what may be affecting these changes in skills inequality during the upper secondary phase? Well, we draw on two theories. The first, positional theory from Raymond Boudon, which argues in very general terms that countries whose education systems have more branching points will be likely to generate greater inequality in educational outcomes. And this is partly, he says, because young people, because of the choices that students make, which are partly influenced by their social background and their aspirations and so on, these choices will often exacerbate skills inequalities. And one derivation you can make from this is that a degree of standardization in the curriculum may reduce skills inequality. There's another strand of research which, as we'll see, partly contradicts this, which suggests that where there's greater parity of esteem in upper secondary systems between academic and vocational tracks, this is likely to reduce skills inequality. And I'll say something about why it contradicts the other one to some extent later. So we hypothesize here that the mitigation of skills inequality will be greatest in countries where there are high rates of completion of full ISCED level 3 upper secondary education and training, And this is defined as 2 years or more of upper secondary. That's what I mean by full. Where there is a compulsory core curriculum, which includes the study of maths and the national language, and where there's greater parity of esteem between the general and vocational tracks. Apologies for the error there. And that this is most likely to occur in education and training systems with either a dual system of apprenticeship or an integrated school-based system of general and vocational institutions. The contradiction with the Boudonian theory about branching points here is that dual systems are highly tracked. And you might expect on the basis of Boudon's theory that they generate more inequality, and you'll see that that's not the case on our analysis. We use a typology of education, upper secondary education and training systems, which was quite common at the time that these young people in the sample, and I'll explain that in a minute, went through upper secondary education and training. And it isolates 4 different types of education, upper secondary education and training system. Firstly, there are the system, it's a default arrangement really. There are the systems which are predominantly school-based, which have general and vocational institutions separately, which are dedicated upper secondary institutions. So there's a shift at 15 or so. These tend to have apprenticeship systems, but they represent residual part of the system. Typically, the programs are 3 years or more. They have a common core curriculum. They include maths and the national language as compulsory. And then you have comprehensive school-based general and vocational provision in one institution. This is the US model, more or less, mostly, and it's the Scandinavian model. There's a great deal of difference between the Scandinavian model and the US model, in as much as the US model has much more variation between districts and institutions. So we subdivide this into 2 types for the US and Canada, and Sweden and Norway, which are the countries we have in PIAC. Then you have the track school-based general education and dual system of apprenticeship, generally 3-year programs again with common core subjects, but highly differentiated across the different tracks in terms of subject specialism and in terms of the forms of regulations that apply. 2 countries represent this kind of system in this data set, Austria and Germany. And then you have mixed systems, which have a high diversity of school and employment-based programs, of variable length and quality, but with dominant academic tracks. And these are predominantly Anglophone countries, but Spain would fit quite well into this category as well. Programs are often organized on a flexible modular basis, often with no fixed duration. There tends to be no common core, so maths and the national language aren't mandatory, and they're often more market-oriented with a diversity of providers, private training institutions, and so on. So the key variables which test our hypotheses are as here. And most of the data for these comes from PIAC, but we draw on other data sets where necessary. So what methodology are we using here? Well, this is a pseudo-cohort analysis. We're looking at changes in literacy and numeracy skills inequality after the end of lower secondary schooling, using a pseudo-cohort that's derived from 15-year-olds in PISA 2000 and 27-year-olds in the Survey of Adult Skills conducted 11 years later. I'm not going to go into the specifics and the details. It's true to say that the scaling of the question of the scoring in PISA and PIAC is not identical. On the other hand, when you're looking at distributions, that doesn't matter so much, and particularly not when you're using skills Gini coefficients, but you can come back on this if you want. So what do we find in terms of changes in skills inequality between the two cohorts, 115 in 2000 and 127 11 years later? Well, all countries managed to reduce the inequality in skills outcomes in literacy, but to a greater or lesser extent. Germany is the most successful in mitigating skills inequality. Belgium does well, Norway does well, Czech Republic and Austria. At the other end, Spain, Ireland, England do relatively badly, and you might have noticed that they form countries within a single type, as we identified before. You've got two of the dual system countries here. It's probably worth noting, though, that several of these countries are reducing skills inequality from quite a high level in PISA. So that would be true of Germany at this time. Nevertheless, it still matters how far you reduce skills inequality. If you think that matters, wherever you're starting from is still important. If you look at numeracy, the picture's slightly different, because whereas some countries do reduce skills inequality on this Gini measure, some countries actually increase it during this phase of the life course. So but the country, some of the countries are occupying similar positions, though. Russia, again, is doing very well. Germany is doing very well here. Several of the East, Central and Eastern European countries are reducing skills inequality quite significantly compared with the others. There are a few countries where skills inequality seems to increase during this phase of the life course, including, again, a number of English-speaking countries. Well, notably, actually, USA, Canada, Ireland, and England. So you can see some patterns in here, which to some extent do follow those country groupings that we identified before, but I'll say more about that when I talk about the analysis. When you're looking at the changes in the social gaps in skills, there's a lot of overlap here. You can probably identify three significantly different groups. Certainly at the top, you've got a group which seem to be increasing the social gaps. That includes France and Norway and Ireland and Northern Ireland. And at the bottom, you've got a group that's mitigating social gaps in achievement, which again includes Russia and several Central and Eastern European countries and Germany. But the USA is also down there. But I think there's a problem with how the education levels are categorized in the US compared with other countries, so it's quite difficult to consider that a robust finding. In numeracy skills, well, the patterns are a bit similar. Again, you can probably only identify two significantly different groups. So what we did was a difference in difference analysis of the effects of different types of education system on these skills inequalities relative to the reference group, which is these type 1 systems with the dedicated upper secondary institutions differentiated by vocational and general types of institution. And what we found here was that there's not much difference really between how the comprehensive systems perform and the first group, the dedicated upper secondary, vocational and general systems. And I won't say any more about that because I don't think we've got much time left. There is some argument that the Scandinavian systems, the 2Bs, have some more positive outcomes in mitigating skills inequality in relation to, it's only significant for numeracy, but they don't have any significant effects on inequality of skills opportunities. So it's not a very strong contrast between those systems. Where you find a very strong contrast is between the type 3, which is the dual system countries, and the type 4, which is the mostly Anglophone mixed system countries. And here you see that the dual systems have a significant reducing effect on skills inequality of outcomes in both literacy and numeracy, and also on inequalities of opportunities for numeracy and literacy skills. And in reverse, type 4 systems are associated with increases in inequality of outcomes in both literacy and numeracy, and also on increases in inequality of skills opportunities, and that's all significant. So the real contrast here is between these dual systems and these so-called mixed systems. What are the characteristics that might explain this? Well, the strongest effects are coming from the characteristics that would fit into a bundle of characteristics which are to do with standardization of the curriculum. So the mandatory provision of both maths and the national language in all strands of upper secondary is associated with a reduction in inequality of skills outcomes in both literacy and numeracy. It's also associated with a reduction in inequality of opportunities for both literacy and numeracy. Prevalence of maths, which is to say it's based on a survey which estimates from teachers and other sources how much maths is taught. The prevalence of maths across the upper secondary curricula is associated with a reduction in inequality of skills outcomes in both literacy and numeracy, and a reduction in skills inequalities of opportunities. The completion of full upper secondary education has, again, a significant negative effect on inequalities of skills outcomes in both literacy and numeracy, and on inequalities of skills opportunities in both literacy and numeracy. So it would appear that on both measures of inequality, of reduction of inequality of skills, the mandatory provision of maths and the national language and high rates of completion of full upper secondary education are extremely important. I've got 19 seconds left. This shows you some of the countries. You can see England is up there with very low prevalence of studying maths. That's because it's not compulsory in the upper secondary, or it wasn't then compulsory in the upper secondary curriculum, and rather poor results in terms of mitigating inequality. These are the completion rates, and the countries which have the highest completion rates are some of those countries that seem to mitigate inequality most. So Russia, Poland, Czech Republic, Japan, Austria. Going very quickly here, the effects of parity of esteem are not so prevalent, and that hypothesis is only partially supported by this evidence. The most interesting finding here is that vocational prevalence, that's the proportion of young people who take vocational courses, does seem to be associated with inequality mitigation in literacy, but not elsewhere. We had a measure of the social mix of vocational programs, and a greater social mix on these programs is associated with, again, mitigation of inequality of skills outcomes in literacy. So this would be evident in countries like Germany, Japan, and the Scandinavian countries, not Sweden though. This scatter plot shows you the placing of some of the countries on those two measures. And again, the social mix measure. So, what am I concluding from this? Well, I think the starting point is that countries do vary very significantly on the degree of inequality in skills in literacy and numeracy for young people, and they vary quite significantly on the degree to which they change that during this phase of the life course. Some countries are better at reducing inequalities in this phase than others. I haven't shown you the data on the controls we were using, but I'll just indicate that this seemed to have very little to do with higher education participation rates or unemployment rates, perhaps surprisingly. It seems to be mostly explained by the type and characteristics of education systems. The system characteristics most associated with inequality mitigation then are having high rates of completion of full upper secondary education, 2 years or more, having mandatory maths and the national language on all programs, and to some extent achieving a relative parity of esteem between vocational and academic programs. So the dual systems, Austria and Germany in this sample, combine all of the above in a way and are coming out as the best at mitigating skills inequality, albeit starting from quite a high level. It's important to remember that. The Central and Eastern European countries with high levels of completion at level 3 and generally mandatory core learning, that's in maths and the national language, also seem to be relatively successful, whatever their other system characteristics are, and it's hard to bunch them all together. Countries with mixed systems, with low levels of upper secondary completion, very diverse programs of unequal lengths, and without mandatory maths and language learning, are the least successful. Now, this relates, I should say, to the systems as they were when this sample of young people were going through the system, or when this pseudo-cohort was going through the system. And that's in the early 2000s. To some extent, countries have changed since then. But it does point, I think, to some fairly generalizable policy-relevant issues about the importance of mandatory study of the national language and maths for everybody. Well, it's not surprising. We're measuring literacy and numeracy. But it is surprising in policy terms that some countries didn't always do this. And we still don't, in England, have mandatory maths and English for everybody. So there we are. I think some clear policy conclusions, particularly for England and some of these English-speaking countries with mixed systems, but some positive conclusions on dual systems, I would say. Thank you.
Thank you very much. I guess we can take one quick question, I think, because we are kind of running. Yes, there is a question in the first row. You can have it.
The question is about the reducing or mitigating the inequality. On what expense it comes from? Does it mean that the ones who are sort of clever are hold a little bit back? Or does it mean that the ones who are weak are pushed forward? I ask this question because Estonia is famous for a very equal system. I mean, regarding PISA results, but also the case of PIAC. We have been a little worried. I think the last PISA results reduced our worriness. But otherwise, we have been worried that all this equality mainly comes in the expense of the top performers. We don't have many top performers. So our system is quite good in pushing the weaker students to do better, but not so much the good students to do even better. So in your results, if you compare the countries, would you say that the reducing of inequality is?
Well, it's a very good question, but our analysis can't definitely answer that. I suspect, though, that the reduction of inequality that you're seeing in some of these Central and Eastern European countries and in Germany and Austria in this sample and in Norway, actually, is to do with the people with lower competencies catching up. Why do I say that? Well, we've got a little bit of evidence for it, in as much as rates of participation in higher education have no effect on this at all. I didn't show you the graph, but it's kind of curvy linear. It's not a linear effect. Higher education and the degree to which people are participating is not having much impact on this, probably because PIAC is not measuring the additional skills you get through going through higher education. And so it kind of suggests that it's bringing up the bottom rather than changes at the top end. But you could find out from the analysis. We just didn't do that from the data.
Okay, thank you very much once again. I think we will stop with questions here and move forward. We have later some 15-20 minutes to ask some additional questions if you have. So So our next two presentations will be country examples. And it is my privilege to invite on the floor Dr. Jelko Markovic, senior partner at 3S Management Consulting in Austria. And Austria, I think, is an example of what Professor Green referred to as type 3 upper secondary education, having school-based general education and dual system of vocational on the vocational side. However, it seems that even between countries with dual systems, there are remarkable differences. So Dr. Markovic will speak about the benefits of hybrid systems and double qualifications based on the example of Austria.
Okay, thank you. Thank you very much for the invitation to this important conference. When I received the invitation a few months ago, I was wondering what is your interest in the Austrian case? Because when you look at PISA results, we are more or less mediocre. When you look at higher education enrollments, we are rather bad. And when it comes to lifelong learning, we're not much better either, actually. So I was thinking, what is so special and peculiar about Austria? And after having read also your paper, and Andy, I was thinking, what should I present here? And yeah, there are two peculiarities about the Austrian system, which are maybe worth sharing here. Both have to do with its vocational education. Now, as you know, if you look at general education, but also higher education across Europe, countries show a lot of similarities. But if you look at vocational education, there are really big differences. And to illustrate that, I use this diagram here, which on the bottom line, so on the x-axis, shows the share of students in vocational education at the upper secondary level in comparison to general education, so to say. So for instance, the Czech Republic at the top with more than, I think, 73 or 74% of students in vocational education in comparison to Greece, for example, where there are only around 30%. Now, this diagram compares the share of VET, which was also used by Andy, with the share of work-based learning, which means how many of the students are enrolled in work-based learning programs, combining competence-based learning, for instance, with school education. And you see the so-called dual countries here at the top for sure, which is Germany and Switzerland, for instance. But you see Austria stands out here somehow by its lack of neighbors. It does not completely go together here with what is usually seen as a dual system country. I haven't shown all the countries here because if I would have done so, then you wouldn't see this little point here, which is Estonia, with a very low rate of both actually share of work-based learning and share of VT in upper secondary education. Now, let's zoom into these bubbles. And before turning to Austria, I would like to use Germany as the so-called best dual system country you can think of. And you probably know also a bit about the German system. So let's see what the German system on upper secondary level looks like. You have mainly two big tracks. You have, you have the grammar schools on the one hand, so general education, and you have then the apprenticeship system on the other hand. And there are another minor groups, people who are not in employment, or you have also sort of vocational grammar school and so on. But the two big pathways are the general track and the dual track. Now, compare this with Austria. This is how Austria looks like. So Austria also has, for sure, the grammar school, as in many other countries, and we have the dual system or apprenticeship system. But in addition, a new focal point comes in, and these are the full-time VT colleges. And these two bubbles make up for the particular position of Austria in the introductory diagram I have just shown. Now, from here on, I would like to focus only on these three main pathways, and please keep your focus on the blue color, so these VT colleges, okay? I briefly characterize them here. The academic upper secondary school, they are classified by the International Standard Classification of Education as ISCA 3, as are the apprenticeship, compared to the VT colleges, which have been classified in the previous classification on level 4 and are now classified as level 5. Now, if you look at the duration, it's 4 years for the grammar school, between 3 and 4 years depending on the sort of apprenticeship, and it's 5 years, an additional year for the VT colleges, and that's for sure also reflected also in the average age of graduation, which is 1 year more or older graduates as for the grammar school. What's interesting, and I will not go into detail into this because this is probably an issue of how you influence as policy international statistics, is how you can do with just 1 more year 2 more levels in ISCAT, but that's maybe something for the break. Which is interesting, which you have to keep in mind for the rest of the presentation, is that these 2 tracks allow direct access after graduation to the university. Yeah, so you have exactly the same sort of final examination, which gives you access to higher education, which is not the case for apprenticeship or only in a limited way. Now, what is also very relevant for our discussion here, I think, is what's about the social background. And that's very clear that parents who are highly educated and have high income, are concentrated here, whereas low income and less educated parents you will find for students in the apprenticeship system. Okay, how have these 3 tracks developed? Because we haven't changed them really much. They exist for quite some time. And how have they changed over time in the last 4 or 5 decades? Now you can see the apprenticeship has steadily declined from the 1980s until now, whereas you can see that the grammar school, the academic secondary school, has slightly increased. So what you see are the overall enrollment, so student numbers. But what is interesting here is this marked increase of the VT colleges, and you see 2 interesting intersection points which I would like to comment on. The first one here in the 1980s, where the VT colleges started to outperform in terms of student enrollments the grammar school, which means that from there on, potentially more candidates for university study come from the vocational education sector than from the general education sector. The second interesting intersection point is here around 2010. From there on, the VT colleges started to outperform even the apprenticeship system. Now, that's why I prefer to think of Austria, meanwhile, as what I call a hybrid system rather than a dual system, because I think for this period it's okay to talk about the dual system because that was the dominant system here. But here it isn't that anymore. It is a hybrid system where you have an equally strong school-based vocational education as is the apprenticeship system. So work-based, school-based are more or less equal. Now, what may explain this development? We don't have clear answers to that, but we can speculate about it. And some of it might be explained by, by educational choice of students. And what you see here are results from a survey which has been done among 5,000 parents in Austria and they have they have a child either in the first class of upper secondary in one of these three tracks, and they were asked what were the reason, or what do you think was the reason why the child has chosen that, what were your arguments for choosing it or recommending it to your child. And what you can see from there is that sorry, I mixed that up. No, again, this one. So what is most important for academic secondary school, so the general education track, is the argument to get access to higher education, for sure. Labor market prospects, relevant vocational education, all this is not so relevant. When you look at the apprenticeship, then, well, they don't have access to higher education, so they rate this for sure not very high. It's more the interest in the job they might get and so on, and for sure the sort of vocational education they get. Now, interestingly is the blue line again. The blue line shows that access to higher education is important for those students. It shows that the reputation is equally high, or maybe even a bit higher than for the general track, whereas it clearly outperforms here the apprenticeship system. And then if you compare the access to higher education, so the blue line, here with the labor market prospects and the relevant vocational education, here comes another item which says vocational education and higher education access. And that's the one which is, so to say, the key argument for students choosing that. And that's what I call a double qualification. A double qualification which gives you, on the one hand, a good vocational education, and on the other hand, access to higher education. Other people speak of hybrid qualifications in this respect, so that's another term you would find in this research about that. But I prefer the term double qualification, also because it's literally a double qualification, which means you get two certificates. You get a certificate which gives you general access to higher education, and you get a VT diploma. So you literally have two qualifications. Now, I will skip the reforms, I think, and come to the labor market outcomes and lifelong learning, which in my view, again, underlines this nature of double qualification. What does graduates 1.5 months after they have graduated from grammar school do? Again, sorry. Almost all of them are in education, which means they are at the university in this case. If you look at the apprenticeship system, 3/4 of them, so almost everyone, is in employment, in a job. If you look at the VT colleges, that's very balanced. So half of them are employed, the other half is in higher education, mainly at universities of applied sciences, but partly also at the traditional universities, whereas here the majority clearly prefers the traditional universities. Now, when you look at lifelong learning, so which means are they participating in training later? How actively are they participating in further training or all forms of learning, actually? So it's not just education. There you can see there is little difference between the VT colleges and the academic secondary schools, whereas apprenticeship is clearly disadvantaged. Yeah, I'd like to summarize my 2 main points. So the first point is Austria has moved from a dual system country, in my view, to what I call a hybrid VT system, combining an equally strong school-based with a work-based track. And I would really suggest that you change your mindset in this respect, not thinking of Austria as a dual system anymore, but make a mind shift towards a hybrid system. And the other one is that apparently these double qualifications are becoming increasingly attractive for young people. The reason for is probably because they at the same time improve your employability, give access to the labor market, and qualify also for further studies, whereas with just, so to say, the graduates from graduating from grammar school, you're more or less forced into education because there is no job markets for them. And when we look at the sort of reputation which I show, then it seems that this sort of double qualification also facilitates parity of esteem between vocational education and general education. Thank you for listening.
Thank you very much. Do we have any questions? Again, here in the first row.
Thank you. I'm sitting.
Please tell your name.
I'm the Minister of Education from Estonia. We are interested in this. Are there differences between college and apprentices, taking into account the study fields?
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Yeah.
So in apprentices, it's more technical?
No. You can say that they're covering broadly the same fields, but apprenticeship is also more occupation specific, so it's directed to a particular occupation, whereas in the VT colleges it's much broader, so you would be qualified, for instance, for a sector like tourism, and within the sector for certain occupations, whereas in the apprenticeship you would either learn to become a cook or a waiter, whatever. So it's more specific in the apprenticeship than in the VET college. But the coverage is quite the same. So you have health, tourism, manufacturing, construction, almost all areas. I haven't shown the figures or I have not referred to the figures on gender, but you can, I mean, gender segregation in VT is very strong everywhere due to the occupational fields, but overall gender is more equal in the VT colleges than in the apprenticeship system. Yeah.
Thank you.
We have another question. Maybe I will ask one myself also in between. I mean, you obviously do have a vocational education school system with very good reputation, and kind of everybody would like to have that such, but how do you do it? I mean, how do you actually, how is it so that vocational education at vocational schools is so much valued in Austria? Because in Estonia, I believe it's frank to say that it isn't, so it has significantly lower reputation.
Well, I'm not a minister who would have an easy answer to that, probably. I mean, the colleges I referred to have a very long tradition already. They were established in the 1960s and then continuously further developed. Within the ministry, I would say they have a very strong lobby. Yeah, so it's become one of the really strong directorates also within the ministry. And I think a major difference to other countries who had maybe comparable institutions is that these were transformed to the higher education sector, so becoming polytechnics, for instance, in Switzerland, and that was not the case in Austria for many reasons. So, yeah, this, we haven't done this sort of upgrading, but the way now on the one hand, the new ISCAT classification, but on the other hand, also the European qualification framework and the national qualification framework discussion comes in. It's also a big question, where to clearly position them. And so maybe that will bring, again, a change or a debate about how to change these. Yeah.
Thank you. And we had one question.
Yeah, a very short question. I'm Caroline Gijslings from the Ministry of Education in Flanders, in Belgium. What about school dropouts in those vet colleges, also compared to apprenticeship and general education, general academic education?
I don't have the figures with me. I think it's higher in the vocational education sector, particularly in the VT colleges, which in general, in my view, are also more demanding than the grammar school, which means more hours, one additional year at an age which is not easy. Yeah, so dropouts is definitely a concern, but I can deliver later on figures if you like. I don't have it with me. Yeah.
Thank you once again.
Thank you.
And in our final presentation, we will shift our focus on the transition from secondary education to higher education. Based on Norwegian example, it is my pleasure to introduce Gro Beate Wiggen, who is Senior Advisor at the Ministry of Higher Education, Department of Higher Education in the Norwegian Ministry of Education and Research. And the topic of her presentation is transition between upper secondary education and higher education, student access according to background, and policies to improve success rates. Please, the floor is yours.
And thank you very much for inviting me. I feel a bit bad about coming as a bureaucrat after all these scientists, this will be what is it called, science light or something. But I'll try to see through statistics how well upper secondary education and training functions in terms of recruitment and completion of higher education. I will also look at social background. And I do not here distinguish between any types of upper secondary education and training. So there are very many ways of entering higher education, and in the general matriculation standard or the minimum entrance requirements, it's possible to come through the vocational way with the top-up of generic subjects. So in statistics, they're not distinguished. And at the end of my presentation, I will go through, I'll present some of recent policy initiatives, just to see how we're thinking of working towards the future to improve the system, because all systems need improvement all the time. The table you see here is age distribution of applicants to higher education and the new students. So the numbers aren't really important, except that you see that the blue columns represent the youngest age group, those aged 21 and below. And the interesting thing about that group is that they enter higher education only on the basis of their upper secondary education and training. In the other age groups, there might be other factors counting. And also that, it's also in our national regulations, half the places in higher education are reserved for that group. But anyway, from left to right, you have the applicants, the qualified applicants, those who get an offer, and those who start studying. It should be mentioned that the little green group that you see to the right, those aged 46 or above, and also the brown one, aged 26 to 45. Those groups are probably a little bit bigger in terms of starting studies because there is local. There is a system of recognition of prior learning that make it possible for people in those groups to enter higher education through local recruitment. Now to how well these different age groups do. It may be hard to read, but this table then is the educational status in 2016 of the entire cohort that started in 2008. So it's every single person in the country that started higher education in 2008 and distributed according to how old or young they are. And the interesting part, well, is that 8 years after beginning of studies, 80% of the youngest group, those 20 or younger, had a degree. And if you look at those aged 40 or above, when they started studies, 80% do not have a degree. Just the intermediate groups do, in the intermediate groups, the results are intermediate. And it's, of course, those numbers do not say why that is so. But I think it's fair to say that it indicates two things, and it is that that the upper secondary education and training actually prepares well for higher education. Those who remember what they learned there seem to get through the higher education well. And that it's also the same, if you inverse the argument, it's hard to successfully complete higher education studies when the memory of what happened in upper secondary education and training dates too far back, and you have lost the habit of studying. Now, there are all sorts of modifications you can make in this, because we know that in the old age groups there are people entering higher education who have no intention of completing a degree. I mean, some of them might want a one-year course in business administration to better run their little family business, or, there are or they might just want a few, to learn a little bit about philosophy or history of the art without really doing this in a serious way. But still, the numbers are very, what do you say? They are very, they catch your attention, 79.5% no degree after 8 years. So the morale will be to try and recruit people young if you want them to take higher education or to do something. At least do not wait too long. But now, age is one category. Then I said I would also look at the social background, and here I looked at the educational. Sorry. Let's move your hair. Oh yeah. Sorry. I have a technical hair problem, but I have no pockets at the stand here, and so anyway. These mics are not meant for women. Income is not a relevant thing to look at, because it's very hard to see any sort of social differences in terms of parents' income when it comes to the Norwegian student population. But there is a marked difference in terms of parents' educational background. And that, of course, complicates a little bit the social background picture I just showed you. But what you say, what this table shows you is a classical thing, is that parents, the children of parents with higher education are overrepresented in the student population, and similarly the other way around, the children of parents with only compulsory education, that is the lower secondary, as the highest attainment level, they're underrepresented. But I'd like to draw your attention to one point, which is what you say gives hope for the future. One thing is that the student population in 2016 is younger than the one in 2001. You know, there are more people in the age group 19 to 24 that enter higher education. Even if the cohorts are bigger now, there is a higher share of the cohort entering higher education, and the part of the cohort whose parents have little or just compulsory education, they have lifted themselves in terms of participation in higher education too. So they are, you see the mother and father has lower secondary education was 11. The share of that group that was in higher education in 2001 was 11, and it's 17.8 in 2016. So there has been an increase in those groups as well. But whether this means, it could mean that the changes that have been done to upper secondary school and training in the meantime have done something to compensate for social background in those younger cohorts, at least when it comes to recruitment to higher education. But it's hard to prove whether it's that or all the social factors. But there is a change. This is my last table, and it's the same group of students that I showed previously according to age. The people who started higher education in 2008, all of them, and then according to attainment level of educational attainment of parents. And you see that nearly 80% of the students whose parents have a higher education of more than 4 years duration have completed a degree in 2016. So it's the same. I'm not sure if the same as the young ones, but it's a sort of same proportion. And we see that more than half of the students whose parents only have lower secondary education still had no degree after 8 years. So background counts still, even if participation is higher. It is very hard to know how much is social, how much is education, but it is striking that we do have a challenge in terms of the social dimension, and that we still have to work on that when you look at these figures. So now I'd like to come to what we're doing, what we're working on. The present government, they've just been re-elected with a little less numbers than they had before, but they've been working very systematically on quality at all levels of education and training, starting with early childhood education. And I've mentioned some recent white papers here. So the first one goes on content in kindergartens, teaching, and the next one, the renewal of school curriculum. It goes back to one of the previous speakers today and what he said about the time for in-depth thinking, because what we had a Royal Commission that wrote a green paper, and they found that the school curriculum is actually overcrowded. Everyone has a good idea as to what should be learned in school, And it's very easy to put things in, but it's very hard then afterwards to take something out. And the result is that there was no real time to think and go deep into things. So now we've started a review of the curriculum to try and find room for the more in-depth work and concentration. And the most recent white paper on school promotes early intervention. It has been a dogma for a while, but this time they're going to have more of a system so that there is assistance from national teams of school advisors to local authorities that have continuous poor school results. And there should be mandatory provision immediately to young children who lag behind in reading, writing and maths in the first years of school. The Norwegian tradition is a little bit wait and see. We've always tended to be a bit optimistic and think that, well, if you just give him or her a little more time, it will sort of sort itself out. But apparently it doesn't. So now the decision is that we should not wait and see. We should do something now when the school sees that there is trouble. As I come from higher education, I've chosen a picture there. It's the University of Tromsø under the Aurora Borealis. So it's an educational picture. I also like to say that my last point will be on just briefly on higher education. Is that how well a student functions in higher education is partly the luggage, what they bring with them from upper secondary level, but of course it's also how they're received and followed up where they come. And I was part of the drafting team of this white paper on quality culture in higher education, and where there's a lot of measures to promote better teaching in higher education through peer reviews, try and find a system for rewarding teaching excellence, a funding scheme, and an indicator portal. I see I have 0 minutes left, so I think I will, and I could talk for ages on this particular subject, so I think I will stop here and rather ask for questions. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Roberta. And do we have any questions? Yes, please.
Thank you. Petri Haltia from Finland, the Ministry of Education and Culture, so another bureaucrat. Nice to meet you. So, about the last slide, I was just wondering whether you still already have some ideas on how you would reward for teaching excellence. So on what basis would you reward somebody? I mean, this is a very, very complicated and difficult question.
Yeah, it is a very complicated question. You know, we've started with the thing you always start with when you want to do a thing like that. You ask an expert group to come up with some good ways of doing it. So we have 2 working groups going. One is on what should be pedagogical requirements. And because we want to, I think we want to change the regulations on qualification requirements for academic staff, so that we increase the requirements of pedagogical competence to become a full professor compared to, an assistant professor or junior position. And it's a complicated system. So we as I think we start with the working groups. I think another thing is that we want to have more competitive funding for educational projects, because we see that in research, we have seen that we have something called Centers for Educational Excellence, and with little funding, we've created. We have got a lot of very good projects and very good teaching going. So we think that if you try to appeal to the research part of the mind of professors when they're doing education, rather than the education part somehow, we hope that will, being project leaders, maybe getting some sort of project funding that they rule over themselves, that we haven't lined, but trying to design something that feels like being individually attractive to researchers or teachers, professors, would be a way of going about it.
Thank you. Do we have any other questions? If not, then I think we can move on to a small panel discussion. And I will start off with a more general question, and then I think we will see where the discussion takes us. If you have any additional questions concerning the presentations or the later discussion, then the floor is open. Please feel free to ask anything you like. But I think we had one maybe a more theoretical presentation and also 2 country examples. And I think what would be interesting to conclude the session is with some suggestions about what should we do? How can we create these supportive learning environments? I mean, supporting in this respect that they help us to transfer from one level of education to another, but also to keep us active in acquiring skills also later in life. So what should governments do in order to create that kind of systems? Andy, maybe you can start.
It depends. I mean, your priorities depend a bit where you're starting from. So, with regards to the different groups of countries I was looking at, they have very different starting points in their success in facilitating education and indeed work transitions. So it may be quite difficult to answer that, in a universal way. Probably the analysis we did reflects a kind of abiding concern with what's happening in certain English-speaking countries with regard to the failure to reduce skills inequality in upper secondary, and certain reasons for that. But other groups of countries are facing different types of problem. The transitions may be better, but you were saying in Norway that completion rates of older higher education graduates are pretty poor.
Yeah.
You kind of concluded rather, without having much time to elaborate on it, that suggests you should encourage people to do their higher education earlier. But another way of looking at that, I suppose, is that at least some of those who failed to do it earlier managed to complete later. Yeah. So it's the overall higher education completion rate is going up, but maybe at some cost. I don't know. I think the issues are different in different countries, but I do think the popularity of the twin vocational tracks is very interesting, and quite a lot of research I've seen is looking at it in regard to different countries, and clearly to make the vocational learning successful. You've got to encourage young people to think that it's going to lead to good outcomes. And having both options of quite good labour market outcomes and quite good progression rates to higher education makes it a more popular choice. And if vocational education is more valued by the people that take it, and they're more motivated, then this seems to be quite a good solution. And there are versions of this, I understand, also in Switzerland and probably in Germany as well. So this kind of hybrid model probably is the way that a lot of countries are now thinking of how to improve vocational tracks. But I think they're done slightly differently in different countries, aren't they?
Maybe you care to comment?
Yeah, I mean, I think it's not a question of how to reform the one or the other system to become part of the one or the other group, because, I mean, reforming upper secondary education is not an easy task, and if so, it takes you 20 years to see any results. But what I find interesting, and I'm not sure if I get all the results you Andy presented correct, but my impression is that there are at least two choices when it comes to mitigating skills inequalities. The one is either having a good and strong vocational education and quality vocational education provided, in addition for sure to the general track, or you better have no vocational education at all, but having bad vocational education is the worst you can do. I don't know if you would agree to that, but looking at the country groupings and what you have shown in terms of the success of the dual system, but also some of the Eastern countries, I would be inclined to see it that way. And for coming from a country with a I would say, quite high quality vocational education system, which is not, in my view, due to the apprenticeship part, at least not in Austria. That is the case in Switzerland and in Germany, where the apprenticeship, the quality of apprenticeship is much higher than in Austria. But the reason in Austria is because of this hybrid system I presented. But overall, all these three countries provide rather strong and high quality vocational education systems. And this is not the case in most other countries, in which vocational education is more or less a second chance. I mean, Norway is also an exception, I would say. And there are big differences between Norway and Sweden, which you put, I think, into one group, whereas in Sweden there is almost no vocational education or little vocational education. The Swedish system
is very different because they have what you call the practical training or apprenticeship is not part of the formal system, and it's after they complete the upper secondary level. Whereas in Norway, the most popular option for vocational training is 2 years in school and 2 years in apprenticeship, with an exam at the end then to test. And the problem, I mean, that is a very respected and very popular option. The challenge is always to have enough apprenticeship places to match the student desires, because, I mean, sometimes you have loads of people who want to become car mechanics, and there isn't all that much recruitment to garages, and so finding the sort of good way of matching student wishes with the real offers in business and industry is very difficult. And there has been a challenge with in the building industry, when businesses have found easy immigrant labor rather than much more profitable than recruiting young apprentices who need to be taught from scratch. And so, but the government last year decided that in public calls for tenders now, there should be a compulsory requirement that the business that gets a contract has apprentices to be able to make the secure a bit better the offer of apprenticeship places, because it's something everyone wants, all the social partners, all the politicians, but it has to come down to practical life and finding how to to get. Norwegian businesses are very small. I mean, there are lots of them that are sort of 4, 5, 6 employees. And so small and medium-sized enterprises, a small part is very much smaller than in many other countries, and that is a challenge when you want to have a constant recruitment of apprentices.
But this is true in most countries now, isn't it? That the number of apprentice places offered by firms isn't matching the demand, which means that almost all countries actually are moving towards some kind of hybrid provision. Germany is as well, isn't it? And I mean, the system you describe in Norway, in a way, is hybrid provision. I mean, it's half 2 years of school-based VET, followed by 2 years of an apprenticeship, which I guess is organised by the schools, but it's work-based. There are different forms of this kind of hybrid vocational, but it seems, that the pure form of a dual system apprenticeship is not really possible any longer because not enough firms are recruiting apprentices because they're recruiting more graduates instead.
Well, Switzerland shows that it's possible, but it's the only country I know. And they really also succeeded with various reforms of the apprenticeship system to keep the overall level in enrollments high and even increasingly. So you can do it, but it's the only country I know.
I'm sorry, I will stop you for a moment. These have been very interesting comments, and it seems that there is no one-size-fits-all solutions, but very good vocational system is always good to have. But we have also a question from the.
Just a brief statement.
A moment, the microphone, please.
In Ireland, we have discovered that the greatest way of improving the learner's internal motivation to follow any course is to convince the mother of which would be the best for the child or their student to do. So the maternal influence in an Irish context is really significant and important.
Oh, very interesting. Thank you for that comment. We have another question here in the second row.
This was my question all the time. In how far can this change from apprenticeship to VET systems be caused by the fact that there were no places for apprentices anymore, or less places? And the second point I wanted to ask about Austria is, couldn't it be a much better system if this apprentice system would also give entrance to higher education?
Yes, may I start with the second one? Meanwhile, we realized that, and there were 2 reforms I have not spoken about. In 1997, a new examination was introduced which gives graduates from the apprenticeship system access to higher education. So in 1997, the previously dead end of the apprenticeship system ceased. In 2008, they have reformed that in the way that you, not only as a graduate, but already during your apprenticeship system, you can prepare for this examination. And meanwhile, I think 10% or around 10% of apprentices choose these courses and make these or pass these examination. Still, the level of those entering then higher education is low, but there is now the possibility, and I think the further reforms or trends go towards this direction. So we have done our homework in this respect, I think, but I hadn't time to present it. And the other question, yes, indeed, the decrease of the apprenticeship system certainly has to do with a decrease in employer engagement, and much has been done in terms of co-funding and things like that to keep employer engagement high. But I think the main reason for the high increase in enrollments in VT is because they offer these sort of double qualifications, which is just more attractive, and together with that, the sort of reputation. And they're highly reputed, and this is a big difference. And in this respect, I think this old discussion we had already 20 years ago about parity of esteem between vocational education and general education, and the work you referred to from Michael Young and Larson and so on, is still very important. I mean, these things are not solved, and as long as we do not really get equal esteem here, it will continue to be a problem in any system, I think so. Yeah.
Thank you for this comment. I think we can take one more question. Yes, there in the 5th or 6th row, somewhere there in the middle.
Yes, thank you very much. My name is Arnold Boer. I represent UEAPME, the European Employers of Crafts and SMEs. It was interesting to hear that you commented a lot on the apprenticeship system and also how it works, for instance, in Austria with a hybrid system. And it came up how difficult it is in countries with lots of SMEs, and especially small businesses also in Norway, how they have difficulties in recruiting. I just had one comment on that and then a question, because the one important comment is that in countries where it does function well, Switzerland was mentioned, but I think there are many other countries where it does function well also, even if it's on local levels, for instance. You have to sometimes break down also in sectors and so on. In those countries, it often works well because of the strong cooperation between the world of work and the world of education. And where this cooperation exists, it's also, both sides are open to understanding what are the needs. Small businesses especially, they need a return on investments. All employers need, of course, a return on investment in providing apprenticeship placements. If you want that, you need sometimes longer periods of training. You need sometimes involvement in the curriculum. You need sometimes that the social partners are actively involved in the governance of the apprenticeship system. Yeah. That was briefly the comment. So it is possible. I just want to want to remove the idea that it is very difficult overall. It is complex, of course, but it is possible. One question, to Professor Markovic about the Austrian system. I was wondering to what extent you included in your data also the master craftsman titles in Austria. Is the Meisterbrief, for instance, because these are qualifications at much higher levels of education, so already challenging, I would say, the concept that vocational training or dual education is strictly limited to lower education levels. But that's a very important form of higher education in Austria and Switzerland as well. And I was wondering to what extent you have elaborated that as well. Thank you.
So thank you very much for the questions. And I believe we have to conclude this session. I'm sorry. Yes, of course. A quick remark as well.
Yeah, I can make it very, very briefly. So, I mean, in the data of what I presented, I just focus on the upper secondary level, and therefore, for sure, the master craftsman is not part of that. But that points me or brings me to another, I think, important issue, and that's the question, in particular when it comes to parity of esteem, how do you deal with higher vocational education? Yeah, how do you organize that? Yeah, and is there such a higher vocational education? Even I wouldn't say. I mean, there is a sort of higher VET which is not university VET, or polytechnics, but a different way of organizing higher VETs, and only by that you will be able to improve also parity of esteem. So for us, it's very important to see, for instance, in the discussion with the national qualification frameworks, where do these master craftsmen examination or qualification come in, and will this whole part develop as a sector of its own, and also also seeing itself as a sector, I think that's an important issue. Or will that all be further dominated by higher education institutions, so that you still have a very marginalized parallel sector on the other hand? So much has to do with that, I think, with upwards mobility in this sector. Yeah.
Very briefly, I just want to say, in the vocational curricula at upper secondary level in Norway are made in cooperation with the social partners. But what my point earlier was that the social, they're very recognized. The point is the social partners don't sign the employment contract with the apprentice. And that's where you can get the wrong. It's not the lack of esteem of the apprentice and that the curriculum would be right or is not good enough. It's that simply it's the number of people who want to recruit an apprentice just in a particular year compared to the number of people who want an apprenticeship. And that's a different issue. So the losers are those who complete their vocational training on a school-based level because they're very disappointed. They would have wanted the apprenticeship. But the social partners have been involved in both versions of the curriculum. So I have also, part of my work is also on the, vocational post-secondary / tertiary that you mentioned, not the master, because that's a different law and a different system. But you raise a very complicated issue, and we're very late in the evening, so I think that would be over a coffee or something.
So, thank you very much for the comments. Well, it's quite difficult actually to conclude the session. I think, of course, learning ecosystems are very complex ecosystems and teaching environments as such. And it is, of course, quite difficult to take some bits and pieces and insert into some other systems. It's probably not going to work. But in the light of the discussions we have had today, I think it's maybe fair to say that if we have equality of skill distributions in mind, then it seems to me that in systems that are very highly fragmented, maybe some direction towards greater standardization would be something that could improve the outcomes. This is maybe something to think about. And also the relative parity of esteem, as well as, parity of exposure to the curricula, so to say, between vocational education and academic programs is probably something that would be a good thing to have. But of course, especially when taking into account Estonian struggles in improving the vocational education, the renommee of vocational education, this is significantly more easier said than done. It's probably something that it's easy to have. If you have a longer tradition, then this is something that you just have. But if you don't have that kind of tradition, then to create it from scratch is quite difficult. And also, as a final conclusion, maybe the Austrian example was quite interesting in this respect, that having these longer programs in vocational schools or colleges that can provide you with a good access to both vocational world as well, or labor market as well as higher education is maybe something to think about, because this seems to be quite desirable. So, but I think we have reached we have most certainly exceeded our time limit. So I think we have to conclude. Thank you again for participating in this interesting discussion. Please join me in thanking our speakers. if I do understand correctly, the conclusions from this session will serve as input to tomorrow's panel discussion. So I hope we have made some valuable points. And concerning further activities, if I'm not mistaken, a guided walking tour in the Old Town to the dinner venue will begin at 6:45. And this is followed by a formal dinner at 8 o'clock. So I hope to meet you all there. Thank you.